This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come about more to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
these people are in very high positions, yeah?
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 63. I am your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we're going to let ourselves be guided by the numbers once again, as we do sometimes. 63, yes. To me, it's a number that really conjures on just one thing. I don't know about you.
Well, yeah, I mean...
When you see the number 63...
Do I necessarily think about Kennedy? I don't know. Maybe I do. I couldn't really tell you. Like, I'd have to be in the moment of seeing 63 without any priming to really be able to inform you if I think about Kennedy. I think maybe if I see November and 63 together, maybe. I don't know, like 11?
11, 22, 63, which I think does
obviously,
have some sus numerological significance. And Stephen King
what
knows
is it? Because that
it,
show or that short story by him that became
it was pretty lame. It was pretty lame.
I didn't watch it.
Not only did
Oswald
do it, but then like by thwarting it, it ruins the world.
I'm sure that S.K. Bain could tell you
alert.
like what the significance of that is. I really should.
Well, there actually is. There is a book or an essay, I believe, called King Kill 33. I forget the name of the author. He was like a more mid-century conspiracy writer, but he and others, I think even S.K. Bain has alluded to the fact that it was like an elaborate Masonic
he has a whole book
ritual.
That's pretty much about it.
Like many people have alluded to it. However, as some might think, if maybe one day we will dive into the Masonic angle
we should, yes.
of JFK, but today I guess we're taking a slightly more social, historical, materialist, I guess, exploration of the assassination of our dear president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Yeah, it's much more down the middle. Kind of, regretting that we didn't read S.K. Bain's book about Kennedy, but we have something. Your more standard kind of take, almost like a meta-historical piece. We're looking at a very archetypal, down-the-middle analysis of this. Very workmanlike, very, pretty scholarly as these things go. Unlike S.K. Bain, there's an index. There's like footnotes that are, there's footnotes at all.
Or Peter Schweizer, for that matter. It's not just interviews with like the Vulcan squad, bragging about their crimes.
Word.
Yeah, but today, I mean, we've mentioned this book before, and I think we thought it's kind of under-examined, I think, both in the conspiracy world and in mainstream kind of, I don't know, political, sociological kind of discourse, and that is Carl Oglesby's The Yankee and Cowboy War, which came out, in 1976. And I think we brought it up in our trial of Chomsky, basically. Yes. I think because Lorenzo A.E. wrote in the Chomsky and the Compatible Left essay, kind of quoted this book at length and positively juxtaposed it with Chomsky's own writings on the subjects of like left-wing conspiracies, and showed how I think made a really good point in that even though Carl Oglesby never self-identified as a Marxist or a Marxist-Leninist or anything like that, I think he called himself a radical centrist. This book comes off as very Marxist, basically, in its analysis, right? Like, would you agree? In a lot, I mean,
yes,
at least, certainly in the types of language.
He was like an SDS guy. I think he even mentions Marx.
He does.
A couple times.
He does. In the beginning, when I think he talks about the importance of the American frontier to the development of American capitalism. He says that was something that Marx kind of, not that Marx. What's the meme going around right now? Like Marx failed to consider that a boat
Marx
failed to consider the Suez Canal. Yeah. But he did consider it. But
he considered the importance of the Suez Canal. It was like, kind of a permutation on his words that he considered a boat getting stuck in there.
He did offer it as a specific example. But I think
it was like a companion to Marx. Let's be specific here. Like that, offered it as an example. It wasn't a quote from Marx. But. Yeah,
that wasn't from I thought that was from something Marx actually wrote.
It was from a companion to Capital, I think. But Marx did bring up the Suez Canal, but he didn't bring up the idea of a boat getting stuck in it. But that was something that someone else extrapolated from.
Well, his influence just makes everybody succeed at considering things.
Yes.
We can say.
Right.
I think, but I think Oglesby, he does a very interesting and I think kind of creative sort of class, like meta class analysis of American capitalism, and sort of builds this epistemological framework for understanding American politics and even American parapolitics in a way that I feel is very... I remember reading this book several years ago. It might have been in 2018. I feel like I read it early on in the Trump era, and I found it to be extremely enlightening for what we were going through back then. And I thought it was interesting that there was really like, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, the dialectic that Oglesby describes in this book kind of permeates absolutely everything that we do. It's like the fundamental sort of red-blue dialectic, basically, in American the American political sphere. But also at the same time, like that red and blue thing is almost like these are like superhero abstractions fighting each other, and it kind of obscures the actual like social economic base of these two factions, which ultimately really are driven by different factions of the ruling class. So it's not so much about like the coalition of voters in like the base or whatever, but we're focusing on the people, the drivers of politics, which are business elites for the most part, right? Along with a certain class of like exalted sort of intellectual, scientific, bureaucratic, managerial sort of class workers as well. But like that, we're basically talking about elites, more or less. Yeah. Yes. And he breaks this down into basically two factions of elites, which he traces at least as far back to the schisms of the Civil War, and suggests or postulates that they have basically kind of persisted and morphed somewhat, but kind of stayed more or less the same. And he presents this as the key to understanding the turbulent events of the 60s and 70s. This is the titular
Yankee and Cowboy thing. Yeah, it's very it's very dialectical. Definitely, it's aptly said that it is
extreme. Oh well, and the idea of a capitalist ruling class being dialectically sort of pitted against itself, or different factions in it being pitted against itself, is an interesting thing that I feel like I don't know. It's like maybe sometimes that gets over exaggerated today, in that like Elon Musk is gonna like beat all the capitalists we don't like and then make capitalism good and cool, or there's a kind of maybe people that have more socialist leanings today would kind of just look at like the capitalist with a capital C as just like this like gigantic blob that doesn't really have like contradictions within itself. And I think if you look at it, like on the one hand, that can be effective for mobilizing people to hate all corporations or whatever, but it's not a very dialectical way, I think, ultimately, of looking at it, especially when most of like the forces of reaction and imperialism and capital and like global, transnational capital have pretty much dominated most of the world, with a few spots sort of resisting it or holding out or kind of blacklisted from the system, like DPRK, Cuba, Iran, Syria, but Venezuela. Like there's maybe 10 to 15 countries. You can't really say that China is like standing, even though they're a counterweight.
Not blacklisted. They're certainly not blacklisted.
No, in a way,
Iran
actually,
is
too.
Like,
if you
not
no, sorry,
it was supposed to be less blacklisted, but they're becoming maybe they were blacklisted again for a while. Tensions kind of flared, but we'll see what happens. There might be some jockeying, but anyway, they just did a whole big thing.
It's even
China,
interesting to think, if you extrapolate this kind of dialectical framework to like modern global capitalism, that you could even almost look at like the tensions between China and the overall like U.S. Or I don't know, Atlanticist kind of elites as another kind of like Yankee and Cowboy War, but happening more on a global stage, where they're both these kind of capitalist factions competing with one another. But like that doesn't mean that the competition is like fake, or that it doesn't have big consequences, or I think it's inevitable, right? With capitalism is always going to be about competition and attrition and like a dog eat dog struggle, basically.
Yeah, and I feel like Oglesby, in a way, at least sort of presages that, because I feel like there's certain things that are are a bit problematic or reductive about the idea of like the frontier as being this thing that really shaped like American. It's kind of like a reconfiguration of like the Turner frontier thesis kind of. He's much more critical, and like he mentions the genocide of the natives and everything like that. And
he does.
I think it's certainly true that like that has a huge impact on the nation of the on the United States as it came to be, in its formation as like a political entity. But, I think that he does presage the sort of movement of the frontier to like other countries, to Asia in particular. He's writing, at the time of like, I think it was like 1978 that this was written. Like
76, and 76. I think it was kind of published mostly maybe in 77. But right at peak, kind of like post Watergate. Yeah. Actually, it's so interesting that this came out almost. I think if it came out at the end of 1976, it basically came out almost exactly when Hotel California came out. And I'm looking for the quote here. It even almost exactly quotes the last song, "The Last Resort," which is about the closing of the frontier. And I think it's something like "There is no more new frontier. We have got to make it here," and it's very critical. It's a very critical song, though, about the settling of the frontier.
American generations for whom the frontier is the fact that there is no more frontier, and who must somehow begin to decide how to deal with this. That is an interesting idea, and I wonder like how this formulation would apply to today, because in terms of like at the Atlanticists, I feel like that is like one faction. That would be the Yankee faction, would be like the Atlanticist faction, the one that's looking to Europe, and to like the circumatlantic alliances, versus the Cowboy faction, which is more based in the Southwest and in California, that is looking to maybe Pacific orientation, or, to like some kind of like sovereignty, like based on oil and things like that, different infrastructure and sources of wealth, and different American identity based on, the sovereignty of the sort of the potential of that area of the country. But yeah, that's interesting to think about how this would map to today, because I feel like in a way that almost has changed, where in the book you kind of see that the Yankees sort of turn on the Cowboys after first, paying lip service to the idea of Vietnam, which is a more of a cowboy operation. And like, as we'll see, Ogilvy's whole thesis is that like Kennedy basically is killed for not like being enthusiastic enough or like wanting to disengage from the Vietnam, which is this cowboy endeavor, which in Ogilvy's reasoning is based on kind of this need for the frontier, this sort of mythopoetic need for it, that we why we need to go fight this war is sort of motivated by that. But I feel that, like, in a way, those power structures have kind of shifted orientations on some level. Maybe it's not as simple as to say they've switched, but I almost feel like the Atlanticist, like, side now is more about, like, fighting wars in sort of far-flung regions, or, trying to build democracy, maybe. I guess you could say George W. Bush is probably a cowboy, and he started the Iraq War.
Actually,
but Obama was more of a Yankee, I would say.
Oh, yeah. Obama was definitely an Atlanticist Yankee, for sure. He was definitely Council on Foreign Relations all the way. The interesting
and I guess he
thing,
wanted to scale down, but Trump, I would say he's probably a cowboy, or maybe he's
Trump
a Yankee.
is a cowboy, even though he's literally a Yankee. I think dispositionally and in terms of his base of support. So far it's a
red-blue thing, but it is odd that he's
but
like,
I
we
think
gotta
it
build
applies
a wall
to him.
and everything, and being very isolationist, at least in his rhetoric and like his way of thinking. Like he obviously, like, the whole idea of like Trump the Dove is bullshit. Like, and one of the more infuriating ideas that circulates, that like this person wasn't escalating wars like in many places in the world, but his orientation was a lot less, interventionist and based on, in terms of that paradigm, like the frontier of a Vietnam type thing. That was not Trump in image or really,
but think about it. Think about it this way, because I think there are a few ways that you could see him in kind of continuity with sort of the cowboy tradition, in that he was much more interested in stoking tensions in Asia and South America than he was in focusing on whatever was going on in Europe, and also, I guess, to an extent in Syria as well. But he was basically focused on, he did take a more aggressive posture with Iran and China and Venezuela. He, sort of bungled his way through trying to put Juan Guaido, into Venezuela, which failed. But, and also, I think kind of turned back the clock a little bit on the opening up to Cuba as well, and kind of canceled some of the
and
soft
I guess you could say
things.
Syria is like a European colonial domain.
Because that war had intense interest. Both Libya and Syria were there are certain EU countries and the UK which were deeply kind of invested in those conflicts, and those are their kind of former colonial domains, and obviously a lot of that has to do with like natural gas flows going to Europe. So I think, Trump was kind of like, he had more of a disposition, which is kind of consistent with the cowboys throughout the Cold War, of like a little more like, who gives a shit what the Europeans think about what Western Europe thinks? Like, they can fuck off. Like, basically, Oglesby describes it as basically the cowboys sort of envisioning themselves as, being a part of a civilization that broke from old Europe, whereas the Atlanticists kind of implicitly believe that they exist in as an outflowing or a continuation of European, quote, Western civilization. I mean, they're both factions are basically Western chauvinists, but they kind of do approach it in somewhat different ways. And Oglesby says about like Vietnam that the overwar in Asia has its internal American origin in the native reflex to maintain the Western frontier in the old terms, and to do so at all costs, since our whole way of life hinges on the frontier. What the late-blooming Yankee liberal critics of the Vietnam War refused to hear and recognize between the lines of the pro-war arguments of the more philosophical cowboy hawks was this essential point about the importance of frontier expansion in American life from the beginning. So I don't think he's kind of endorsing.
That doesn't square with that's what doesn't square with Trump, because
you're
Trump,
right.
I think much more symbolically is much more about closure. I mean, build the wall. That's the opposite of expand the frontier. I mean, the frontier is related to like barbed wire and like cordoning off land and conquering. So I mean, maybe it works. Maybe that's an aggressive gesture that could be seen as expansion through enclosure. But I don't know.
I think that maybe I also like one thing that's interesting about the way Oglesby frames all of this is that he does show the capacity for these ruling class factions to sort of change their tune or change their mind over time. Like, he basically talks about how, more or less, while they were not the more enthusiastic of the bunch to want to start a ground war in Vietnam, they were pretty supportive of sending advisors and special forces and weapons and things like that to the Diem regime, in the early 60s. But then it was only after 1968 when they realized they really weren't, their economic interests were not disproportionately benefiting, and it was hurting some of their other interests, which were more Europe focused and basically threatened to basically undermine the overall health of the empire.
It's an interesting parallel between
they switched.
His kind of like it's an interesting parallel between his kind of like special war paradigm, like where he just wanted to send in special forces, to
very Obama.
Oh yeah, exactly. And the drone, like the drones are kind of like the Green Berets or the special forces of today, where it's like a way to fight, but without necessarily committing the same energy as a full scale war. Definitely, you can see the parallels in the orientation.
Yeah. It did make me think a lot about like what is the frontier today, because this economic system does require sort of endless expansion if it's not going to fall into become unstable and sort of collapse on itself, right? I mean, that's a general dynamic. That's a fundamental dynamic of capitalism, and I think we've seen that, where it's constantly searching out new markets to basically set up to create, or I mean, now we're having people like cut pieces of their skin off and sell NFTs, like if you think about it, in terms of like commodifying everything, making new markets. And I think that what this book is written right on the precipice of the sort of information revolution that created this whole new like strata of economic activity and information and stuff like that has been commodified and weaponized and all kinds of other things. And so I wonder if, basically, is the frontier today, as John Perry Barlow said, right? When he declared the independence of cyberspace, that was the new frontier. So that's actually a good example where John Perry Barlow is literally from the cowboy class, basically.
Right.
And basically, grew up in Wyoming from like a Mormon cattle ranching dynasty, and went to an elite prep school, not in the Northeast, but in Colorado, where Bob Weir also went. And but then he did go, I think that is also a thing of sending these cowboy tycoons, sending their children back east to get a little bit of that blue blood establishment credibility, right? Like that's that's definitely a dynamic, like on the West Coast and the West in general, especially further back, because there was even less legitimacy. Like, the railroad tycoon Leland Stanford had to like build his own college and fill it with eugenicists to like, try to have a stab at their own prestige. But nowadays, if you think about like a prototypical cowboy, and even another cowboy, Augustus Housley Stanley III, because he came from like Southern political royalty, which would kind of get lumped in Oglesby's view with the sort of cowboy faction. They ended up helping midwife this new frontier of digital information and cyberspace, which is now being colonized all over again. And I mean, does that not make sense a little bit?
Yes.
That, it kind of this thesis checks out a little bit. They always need a new frontier. And I think, maybe the Cowboys decided in when they, did 9/11, that, we're going to have new land wars in the Middle East, and we're going to embrace our imperial mandate and go around the world. And I think, just as in Vietnam, I mean, I think they got a lot out of it, that things that don't necessarily get drawn attention to. Like, it's not, as Cowboy Trump would say, it wasn't just about like taking the oil or whatever. It certainly wasn't sincerely about like finding WMDs, but it had a lot of like negative externalities. And even you could look at like the second Iraq War as a similar kind of trajectory for the Yankee class, who basically totally voted for it for the most part and like co-signed it when, it was their opportunity in Congress to do so. But then when it started kind of spinning into this chaotic clusterfuck, And, you know, we were like bleeding out kind of money. And once again, Western Europe was pissed at us for doing this. Like, we almost forget now, I think, right, that like France and Germany refused to join our dope coalition of the willing, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, it's like that, even that level of like dissension feels like far, that would be far out to see it today. Like, yeah. But, you know, like that. So then even Hollywood started maybe making some things that were like a little bit anti-war. But you notice as soon as we got the kind of agreement that, okay, we're going to withdraw, which I think came in, I want to say 2007 or 2008, because it was Bush who signed the agreement, the status of forces, that said, okay, in like 4 years, we're going to leave. It's like as soon as that was signed and they kind of got what they wanted, that like, all right, we're going to cut bait from this place. Then it was like the Hurt Locker and all this shit. And then they started glorifying the CIA, who were doing the special war that the Atlanticists were super psyched about doing. That like, no, I mean, wasn't the phrase all of his like, Obama's NatSec people, you know, like, we're using a scalpel, not a hammer, you know, and that's exactly what, of course, their special war did kind of turn into not just a hammer, but like a chainsaw and like pretty bad ways, considering who they armed as their like kind of proxy forces. You know, to rip apart various countries that we wanted to destroy. So, you know, either one is not good, but you can kind of see a bit of a continuity with it. And then for Trump to be basically this cowboy, and we will see there are material links to even the characters and the companies in this book with Donald Trump, though his exact link to this world is always tenuous at best. But he kind of represented like at that point, a much more marginalized faction, I would say, of maybe cowboy elites and like petty bourgeois people that kind of align themselves with the cowboy entrepreneur kind of, worldview. And he rallied those people because, you know, we always say like the deplorables were not simply just a bunch of like poor people and poor white people in trailer parks, but it was like a guy who owns like a jet ski dealership and like, you know, that kind of thing. You know, small business people that feel like the government's like out to get them and they just like hate the Clintons. And Trump is just like, yeah, like he's spouting that kind of like Reagan throwback rhetoric that they just, that you know, feels good to them. Reagan, absolute cowboy president. Bush, won't get too gone on it now. Yeah. But I find it interesting. He wrote this when Bush was CIA director before he got into the White House with Reagan. And I've always thought about the Bush family a lot after reading this book and over the years, because I do feel that Bush was like this unholy, like synthesis of both factions. And that's why he was so fucking powerful.
Yeah, it is interesting because, HW seems much more like a Yankee going by this, like, sort of parlor game alignment. W, obviously, is, like, the cowboyest cowboy ever, oddly, you know. But HW, definitely, and, like, all the Yankee aspects, like, all the symbolical Yankee aspects are so much more prominent, like, in him. But
and, you know, he might have been, in a way, like, he like it's like, you know, just how the mob would like send one of their young guys like out to LA to like run the operation out there. There's a feeling that he was like, because he was sent down to Texas after kind of a random place to go for like this ultimate like Yale cheerleader skull and bones guy to go. But I personally believe that because his roommate, I think it was either at his prep school or at Yale, was literally the son of the guy who was responsible for like recruiting CIA agents out of the Ivy Leagues and stuff. And just like what his dad was doing, like hiding Nazi money during the war and all that kind of shit, and working with Brown Brothers Harriman and the Dulles brothers. Like, I think that he was brought into the CIA probably like right after graduating college, and then he was sent down to Texas and then later to Miami and set up Zapata offshore and was working, I think, out of the JM Wave Station in Miami that was preparing for the Bay of Pigs invasion, and was like running contacts with probably both like the wealthy oil people and people like George de Mohrenschildt, who will come up later in this, and all those people, and basically was like the Eastern the Yankees man in Houston. And so, but then he was able to kind of like straddle this line. He was never really able to convince people he was a Texan, even though he kind of, you know, set up his life there because he was just such a fuddy-duddy wasp. But then he clearly trained his sons, who became like the ultimate Sunbelt governors, like Florida and Texas, to be down home Southern boys and like LARP basically. And so you have to wonder, like, I don't know, but then in a weird way, like, I don't know, they're not exactly a canceled family, but, you know, I guess maybe it was the realization that Jeb Bush, I really don't know. Maybe people really felt like, you know, going in for like a fake fight with Hillary Clinton and just letting her win was kind of not in support of their best interests. So why not, you know, throw out somebody that has a shot? And I don't know.
Well, did they? Yeah, I mean, did they think that he did?
That Trump had a shot?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
That's
really
like,
what...
you know, I'm not sure if Hillary thought that he did. You know, because
no, and of course, you know, she's another one.
Yeah.
If you think about it, even the Clintons kind of straddled these two factions a little bit. Even though I think they've ended up in the Atlanticist faction, kind of definitively, like from probably the presidency onwards. But all that Mena, Arkansas drug trafficking shit in the 80s, that was mostly cowboy action that was going on.
I wonder if Hillary is distinct from Bill in a way.
Maybe.
Like,
I mean, Bill, there was
I feel like
somebody...
Obama is a very, like, Atlanticist type pivot, and, you know, Hillary was a big part of that. I don't know. Yeah.
She was involved. Remember, she was involved in that that foundation that was like funding the Christic Institute in the 80s and doing weird things like that. I think that if I had to bet, I would say Obama and Bill Clinton were both recruited by the CIA in college because Bill was a Rhodes Scholar. I think somebody who went to Oxford with him like claimed that in the 90s that Bill Clinton was recruited by the CIA at Oxford, which kind of makes sense if you think about like every Rhodes Scholar, like Rachel Maddow, Pete Buttigieg, like Bill Clinton, like why wouldn't they recruit them to be some kind of asset, you know, that's like, it's such a prestigious thing. You know, they're probably going to go on to have a prominent career in something. Like, why not just get them right there?
Yeah.
And Obama too. Like, I don't know. You go to Colombia, where so many of the people we talk about have gone, and all of them except Paul Robeson are sus. And Pynchon, I guess. But anyways, back to, I mean, that's just some... extrapolating towards today, but the two biggest things in this that Oglesby is jumping on or focusing on is the assassination of JFK and the Watergate scandal.
Yeah,
which he
these
believes
are kind of seen as two, like, coups, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Like a coup and almost a counter coup by these two different factions. Like one, you know, Dallas being a coup by the Cowboys against the Yankees and Watergate being the reverse. Yeah, that's kind of how it's framed as being, or, you know, how he thinks it's gone down.
Yes, exactly. He thinks that these were when the machinations behind the scenes of basically what he calls clandestinism, which is an interesting kind of term. I kind of like it. You know, the tendency towards like a highly secretive, like compartmentalized sort of, you know, political system.
Yeah, it's a very, because,
elites.
You know, the meat of the book, there's kind of this theoretical framework of like Yankees and Cowboys that we can, you know, return to obviously throughout. But, you know, the actual meat of the book is very much, you know, there's an erudition to it, and there's the evidence is like well presented, and he makes like a very good case like for both, but you know, it is like basically rundowns of either the Kennedy assassination, like, and the motives for it, you know, but also the practicalities of, you know, why the official narrative, like the Warren Commission narrative, doesn't make any sense, and also Watergate particularly. There's a lot around, and there's even an appendix in the version that I have going around, like the plane crash that Dorothy Hunt was in, and why this was, you know, sort of you know, sabotage plane crash, you know, set up as part of retaliation against Howard Hunt. And I think Dorothy Hunt also, you know, was, I guess, involved. So he has an interesting quote about that, which I found pretty interesting. It was early on in the book, around like page 25. You know, he's talking about Carol Quigley, who he borrows from a lot.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
so did Alex Jones, at least back in the day. Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, explained it all in 1966. I think he always said it.
because this is kind of like the idea of like a group, Carl Oglesby says the John Birch Society, well, this is Oglesby talking, but he's kind of summarizing, saying the John Birch Society maintains that linked up with, if not actually behind, the international communist conspiracy is a higher level super cabal of internationalists of United States and Western Europe, led here by Rockefeller Morgan Group and there by the Rothschilds, whose purpose is to create a unified world political order. And Carl Quigley writes, this myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist and has existed for a generation international Anglophile, paging Dr. LaRouche, an Anglophile network which operates to some extent the way the radical right believes the Communist Act. In fact, this network, which you may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups. As we will see below, the Nazis, and frequently does so. I think that's Oglesby who entered those brackets about the Nazis. But I find this interesting on another level too, because I'm tracking the kind of symbolism of like Camelot that runs throughout this. Of course, the Kennedy Camelot stuff, and also
he mentions it a lot.
The Atlanticist round table, as
the round table. I haven't heard round table used as much in describing this kind of network, though. Like the things he's describing are very familiar to everybody. Basically, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the people involved. But I think
you mentions the Rhodes Trust, like that's kind of what.
Yes, he does. The Rhodes Scholar, named after arch. Imperialist butcher Cecil Rhodes.
Right.
The original, the roundtable groups by Quigley's detail report are semi-covert policy and action groups formed at the turn of the first decade of this century on the initiatives of the Rhodes Trust and its dominant trustee of the 1905-1925 period, Lord Milner. Their original political aim was federation of the English-speaking world along lines laid down by Cecil Rhodes. So that, it originally included South Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and the United States. And the UK, of course.
This is the part that I found to be interesting, because this, kind of goes back to what you were talking about before in terms of like the dialectical configuration of, these groups and like of these factions within power. It kind of reminds me almost of some stuff that we were talking about in our Atlantis episode, with Guénon, and like his idea of like the counter tradition, like the Atlantean counter tradition, how it's sort of at war with itself because it must fundamentally be, but this, I think, is an interesting take on, or a good take on some of the topics that we'll deal with in this episode and in the past related to conspiracy in general. He says, what will behold in the Round Table, functioning in the United States through its cover organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, is one focal point among many conspiracies. The whole thrust of the Yankee/Cowboy interpretation is, in fact, dead set against the omnipotent cabal interpretation favored by Gehlen and others of the John Birch Society, basically in the respect that it posits and, a divided. Yeah, it's a typo. Socio-historical American order, conflict-racked and dialectical, rather than serene and hierarchical, in which results constantly elude every faction's intention because all conspire against each and each against all. And this is like an interesting anecdote that he shares.
Oh, yeah.
This point arose in a seminar I was once in with a handful of businessmen and a former ambassador or two in 1970 at the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. The question of conspiracy and government came up. I advanced a theory that government is intrinsically conspiratorial. Blank incredulous stares around the table. Surely you don't propose there is a conspiracy at the top levels. You don't think the Bilderberg... Wait, you think the Bilderberg Group is real? Or, but only turn the tables and ask how much conspiring these men of the world do in the conduct of their own affairs, and the atmosphere changes altogether. Now they're all unbuttoned and full of stories, this one telling how he got his competitor's price list, that one how he found out whom to bribe, the other one how he gathered secret intelligence on his own top staff. Routinely, these businessmen all operated in some respects covertly. They all made sure to acquire and hold the power to do so. They saw nothing irregular in it. They saw it as part of the duty, a submerged part of the job description. only with respect to the higher levels of power or on the national presidency, even though they saw their own corporate brothers skulking about there, were they unwilling to concede the prevalence of clandestine practice. Conspiratorial play is a universal of power politics, and where there is no limit to power, there is no limit to conspiracy. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Yes.
Very I think anybody that rings so true that if you get people just talking about their bit, like in the business world, they are, unless it's something that's like blatantly a felony, they're more likely to boast about, conspiratorial things, like, but it's unacknowledged. It's like there is this kind of like weird code of silence about it, where among colleagues and peers you can joke about these things, but maybe you wouldn't tell the layperson because there's a kind of a PR image to uphold, that there are certain rules, and you just win by applying that good old Protestant work ethic. You know what I mean? And surely not any kind of plotting or conspiring or anything like that. And there is this like third rail at the top of government where for some reason people think, what? Like that's wacky. What do you mean, people?
Yes.
It's like, no, it's like what you do all the time, except probably at the Aspen Institute. But like, it's creepy to think that they kind of are able to kind of if they're able to psyop themselves into not it being so normalized that they don't even realize they're conspiring. Sometimes that's an impression I get, though I don't know if that's actually how these people are when they're in private. But it's that. Yeah,
I guess the idea of a conspiracy is just so poisoned that, like, the notion of it, it's a very effective psyop, like, around the idea of conspiracy theory. I guess it was still, like, pretty much operative, like, at the time that this book was written in the mid-'70s, that the conspiracy theory had this very negative connotation because, obviously it's being mentioned in the book, but I think that, like, for whatever reason, it's just reflexively associated with insanity, even though it makes perfect sense. Like people would just will develop ideas like a conspiracy of 50 plus people is impossible, etc. I don't think that people really examine why a conspiracy is something that it's really true. Like, even if you think of your own life, like your own job, your office, there's always like scheming, lying,
absolutely, within families.
Yeah,
like groups of teenagers, like social relations of like kids. Little kids conspire with each other and talk behind each other's backs.
Of course,
it's something innate.
And the more at stake, the more Byzantine the conspiracies usually become. One would say. I think Kissinger compared. I think Kissinger's remark was that academic politics were more brutal than, or more sort of petty,
cutthroat,
exactly, cutthroat than national politics, because there was less at stake. But he definitely he did compare the two, and so I definitely think that for whatever reason, like, this idea has become poisonous, but people can certainly observe it if people really think about it. It's it does make sense. I mean, we can assess the theories that are put forth in the book like on their own merits, because there's a range of them. But
he I think he sums it up also, I think on page 25 later, where he says that the implicit claim is that a multitude of conspiracies contend in the night. Clandestinism is not the usage of a handful of rogues. It is a formalized practice of an entire class in which 1,000 hands spontaneously join. Conspiracy is the normal continuation of normal politics by normal means. So I mean, I think that's a really good way to look at it, that there's always things that are like happening in the margins that aren't, as Chomsky would say, like when, a group of serious engineers comes forward and says that World Trade Center 7 was detonated by nanothermite, then perhaps I'll take a look at it. But until then, somebody has to like announce. And also, like, television.
How would he be able to assess? Like, that's the thing. Like, when people say that, like, I don't really have a way, like, I'm not like a big controlled demolition guy, but I can't really assess because I'm not an engineer. And like, if you look at the stuff that people say, it's usually pretty nitty gritty, and they're saying things about like how it's physically impossible or whatever, and like, I don't really know. So since Chomsky doesn't know like how water comes out of a faucet, I would not say. I don't think that he would be able to like assess like the, you know, legitimacy of like an engineering based argument. But whatever. Anyway, so
yeah, I think that there's always been conspiring. Think about, you know, the corrupt bargain of 1824, like the Tilden Compromise in 1876 that like ended Reconstruction, ended
Petticoat affair.
Yeah, the Teapot Dome scandal. Like, we could just go on for days. Like, of course people were, you know, the Hunt brothers and the Hunt family pops up in this a lot, like cornering the silver market in 1980. Like, these people with power conspire, and I think Oglesby's right. It's like in a system where there's like absolutely no limits set, like the possibility, where there's no limit to power, there's no limit to conspiracy. So I think the checks and balances that we're told exist in the American system don't actually, you know, they are full of loopholes, basically,
even
by
in the
design,
musical Hamilton, you know, the beloved cultural lodestar of like everyone who tuts any kind of conspiracy theory, you know, and puts it in you know, puts like believing that JFK was assassinated in like get help, like immediately, danger to self and others category of the pyramid. You know, there's a conspiracy depicted, you know, where like Hamilton was like the based POC hero immigrant Hamilton was sleeping with like another guy's wife or whatever, and he blackmailed her, and I guess, you know, there was a whole thing where the Thomas Jefferson and some others found out, you know, and they tried to keep it, they kept it a secret for a while, but, you know, because a conspiracy of more than 50 people is impossible, I guess Hamilton eventually, like, admitted to it, like, tried to get out ahead of it.
Well, what about, like, the American Revolution itself? I'm pretty sure eventually they went public with it, but for a while it was a conspiracy. How many people signed the Declaration of Independence? I think it was more than 50.
I mean, what about the Boston Tea Party that was obviously organized secretly among
probably
people,
only like about 25 people, so it was possible. So
that makes sense. Okay,
it's a very sophisticated dialectical way of looking at it. But you know, he traces that so you have these groups that kind of like stem really from the Civil War, the Northeastern industrialists, and kind of the remnants of the Southern aristocracy, and then the Wild West.
Or, well, I mean, like, really, they go back further than that. I mean, the Civil War was just like a manifestation of them. They go back to, you know, the founding of our country and, you know, the 1619 or whatever, you know, the right.
Well, even as our country in like 1791, as it was like actually codified, is, you know, that's kind of the classic dialectic,
I believe
right?
The founding of America was in 1619, but anyway.
I don't read the New York Times, so I don't know.
Okay,
I'm not going to acknowledge that. The founding of, I don't know, colonies, like it's, is that a thing people are really saying, like insisting that?
I think that's like the idea of the 16. No, I'm like kind of joking, but I think that's the idea of the 1619 project. That's like America's real founding. Like that's the big like provocation of it.
I see.
You know,
that it was like just that, like a Puritan slave colony. I don't know.
Well, that was the time when like slaves were first brought to what would become like in Virginia.
I think we can reasonably say that, you know.
So that was where these frictions originated.
Sure, but then, you know, once we decided to ditch the Articles of Confederation and, you know, write a constitution, and everything that was put in there basically established this like dialectical republic of two different kind of socioeconomic systems, where one was based upon, it was still a little bit nascent at the end of the 18th century, but, you know, based on industrial kind of output and manufacturing and farming and things like that, and I guess like a nascent form of like quote unquote free labor, which wasn't really that free, but and basically not chattel slavery, whereas the South was founded on that. So eventually there were certain contradictions within those two economic systems that, you know, blew up in the 1860s. And then we entered into this new phase, which I guess is, you know, it's kind of, you know, basically you could make an argument that, you know, the real fundamentals of like our capitalist economy have stayed more or less kind of consistent, with a variety of kind of upgrades and transformations. I mean, from like the 1870s to basically the real industrial boom of like the late 1800s and the first Gilded Age to today. It's been a long, strange trip, but I feel like we haven't fully escaped that epoch now that once it's like America maybe had to have a unified economic system in order to literally like conquer the continent and genocide everybody and take all the land and basically build this new country and then expand outward beyond that onto the international stage and kind of become like a capitalist sort of global empire. That really, I think the Civil War is like an incredibly crucial turning point of like consolidation of the economic order of the country. And of course, like I think that in like one of the many supreme ironies, it had to preserve like white supremacy and racism while getting rid of the economic system of chattel slavery, which was no longer working optimally, I guess. I mean, that's it's like a very simplistic overview, but
yeah, well, it wasn't working. It wasn't necessary for the North. The North had become like capable of surviving without it, and maybe there would have been like some consequences had it been allowed to continue. But I think that it created another center of power that needed to be, I think that the sovereignty, I mean, the whole idea of the country being divided or seceding was only possible because of like the slave economy.
That was the main antagonist from mostly the Southern perspective of like why they were so obsessed with states' rights and attempted things like nullification and were always arguing every time a new state. I mean, it really kind of made the conquering of the American frontier a lot more complicated because every time you wanted to make a new state, there had to be this big battle over was it going to be a slave state or a free state, and then everyone was angling to like I forget what the compromise was that was like, okay, we'll do one, you get one, and then we get one, and it was just like it was a whole mess. And then you had people that were abolitionists getting increasingly radical in the 1850s, people like John Brown, like Bleeding Kansas and all that stuff, and then of course you had a lot of like vigilante like frontier violence from like pro-slavery settlers and then people like warring with Native American tribes and the army periodically going on kind of like ethnic cleansing campaigns and all of these different things. And I think that the fundamental contradiction of how are you going to settle the West, basically it perhaps needed that resolution that like, no, we're going to be a capitalist economy based on wage labor and private, ownership of land. And also maybe they still were kind of ahead of the curve or somewhat, I guess compared to most of the countries in Europe in terms of gesturing at being a democratic republic. I don't think it was as acute back then that we really had to outcompete other countries in the world in terms of being like the most progressive place that valued, individual rights and stuff. That was much more acute in the 20th century when we had some competitors in that field, but it was still we're off kind of like doing our own weird thing.
I think that like that was a contributing factor. I don't think that was purely cynical. There was like Uncle Tom's Cabin and like the influence of sentimentalism and abolitionism like in the North, but there also were like largely economic motives.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. That were driving this. There were underlying like material reasons that were in place from the founding. We can't agree about, we can't really pin down when it happened, but at some point the United States was founded, and whenever it was, those tensions were present from the beginning because it was this polycentric thing. There were two centers of power, two ruling classes.
And that frontier thing was like, it was incredibly, I think he makes, a point that even just down to kind of like the existential level or in the ontological level, that particularly people that in the Western United States, like he said, the amount of, I want to see where he discusses Marx. He doesn't really say, Marx failed to consider, but he does mention like the Turner frontier kind of hypothesis and says William Appleman Williams deals with the variation of this question. He argues that the basis for the long-term general or pluralist coalition of the forces of capitalism or plutocracy with the forces of democracy in American politics is the constant companionship of the expanding wilderness frontier. Williams thus stands the Turner frontier on its head, correcting it. I add that another and cognate effect of the frontier in American economic development was to preserve the entrepreneurial option long after the arrival of the vast monopoly structures which tend to consume entrepreneurs. In the states whose political economic histories Marx studied, for example, the frontier was never the factor that it was in America, except as America itself was Europe's Wild West. The rugged individualist self-made rich man, the autonomous man of power, the wildcatter, began to drop out of sight, to lose presence as individual, type, and class with the rise of the current-day computer-centered monopoly corporate formations. The tycoon entrepreneur is, of course, disappearing as a type in America, too, at least as a political force in national life. The Hughes empire, at last, has been corporatized. Old Man Hunt is dead. His sons are bringing Harvard Business School rational bureaucracy to the operation. But that only makes it all the more curious that political power continue to emanate from the type and the person, the image and the reality, the ghost, perhaps, of a creature like Hughes as late as the second victorious presidential campaign of Nixon. Why should the cowboy tycoon have persisted so long as a political force, competent to struggle against the biggest banking cartels for control of the levers of national power? As others have argued, the frontier was a reprieve for democracy. We may note here that it was also a reprieve for capitalism as well, whose internal conflicts were constantly being financed off an endless seeming input of vast stretches of natural riches, having no origin in capitalist production. All that was needed was for the settlers to accept the genocidal elimination of the native population, and a great deal became possible, a great deal. The Purple Mountains, the fruited plains, and generation after generation of American whites were able to accept that program. The Indian Wars won the West. The railroad and highways were laid. The country was resettled by a new race, a new nation. The energies of expansion consumed the continent in about 2 centuries, pushing on to Hawaii and Alaska. There is no way to calculate the impact of that constant territorial expansion on the development of American institutions. There is no way to imagine those institutions apart from the environment created by that expansion. It is a matter our standard national hagiography paints out of the picture, though we make much of the populist saga aspect of the pioneering, never, quote, conquering of the West. How can we congratulate our national performance for its general democracy and constitutionalism without taking into account the background of that constant expansion? We do not teach our children that we are Democrats in order to expand forever and Republicans on condition of an unfrozen western boundary with unclaimed wilderness. To the extent that the American miracle of pluralism exists at all, we still do not know how miraculous it would be in the absence of an expanding frontier, its constant companion till the time of the Chinese Revolution. And I mean, I think he's right that it casts like a very long shadow. He also says that it's like now that when he says some nice things about China, basically that like the success and then successful defense from 1950 to 1975 of the Asian revolutionary nationalist campaigns against further Western dominance in Asia, China, Korea, Vietnam, means that all this has changed. What was once true about the space to the west of America is no longer true and will never be true again. There will never be a time again when the white adventurer may peer over his western horizon at an Asia helplessly plunged in social disorganization. In terms of their social power to operate as a unified people and in the assimilation of technology, the Chinese people are, since 1950, a self-modernizing people, not colonials anymore. And instead of a Wild West, Americans now have a mature common boundary with other moderns like ourselves. Not savages, not redskins, not reds, only modern people like ourselves in a single modern world. This is new for us, a new experience.
This is very interesting in light of like post 9/11.
It really is. Like if only that were still true. They managed to turn the clock back on that, I guess. Mm-hmm, so they managed to like revitalize
I think that was wishful thinking on his part.
I think it was. And also this is written like probably right before Mao died. So he was referring to Maoist China and their achievements before Big Boy Deng came in and did what he did. And also, the idea that, I mean, I guess in a way he is still correct about all 3 of the countries, Vietnam, Korea, and China. that none of them have, like, I would even say China. It's one thing to say China has like adopted a path of like collaboration and revisionism and capitalism, whatever, but like I don't think the U.S. necessarily like beat China or like turned it into a vassal state or whatever, or destroyed it. Like China still exists as like an independent polity, if you will, and America has been forced to like trade with them instead of colonizing them, basically. Like it's better than nothing, but and then you have like Vietnam, who we also trade with, even though we failed to like, you know, destroy their revolution. And then Korea, we just got BTFO'd and they took the pill low. They're never giving it back, and we just like have to suck it, which is kind of interesting that Trump, the cowboy president, like buddied up to Kim Jong-un. I'm not sure how that fits into the paradigm, but who knows? It's not like you get a cowboy playbook if you get elected.
No, I think that
it could have been some cowboy entryism going on.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's some, again, like I don't feel like these like you know, precisely map onto everyone. I think that, you know, Bush, HW, that is someone who kind of like confounds the classification like fully, but I think
he's
that
like a daywalker.
You know, in a true dialectic, you know, there's always influence between the two sides. They're not like sort of starkly mutually exclusive. But I think like just before the portion you read is something interesting that's relevant, like a longer sort of quote from Quigley that's sort of relevant to what we were talking about earlier, where he kind of, you know, he talks about in a footnote some of the Civil War stuff, but also like his sort of more granular paradigm of the Yankee-Cowboy dynamic in his own current context. So he says, Quigley is the author of a huge book about the contemporary world, Tragedy and Hope, you know, to which I will return in chapter 2. I begin my debt to Quigley here by borrowing the following observation from his summary. Noting that since 1950, a revolutionary change has been occurring in American politics, Quigley says this transformation involves, quote, a disintegration of the middle class and a corresponding increase in significance by the petty bourgeoisie, at the same time that economic influence of the older Wall Street financial groups has been weakening and been challenged by new wealth springing up outside the eastern cities, notably in the Southwest and Far West. He continues, these new sources of wealth have been based very largely on government action and government spending, but have nonetheless adopted a petty bourgeois outlook rather than the semi-aristocratic outlook that pervades the Eastern establishment. This new wealth, based on petroleum, natural gas, ruthless exploitation of natural resources, the aviation industry, military bases in the South and West, and finally on space with all its attendant activities. This is very interesting, you know, in light of what we see, like now, you know, you mentioned Elon Musk.
Totally.
Has centered in Texas and Southern California. Its existence for the first time made it possible for the petty bourgeois outlook to make itself felt in the political nomination process instead of in the rewarding effort to influence politics by voting for a Republican candidate nominated under the Eastern establishment influence. By the 1964 election, the major political issue in the country was a financial struggle behind the scenes between the old wealth, civilized in cultures and its foundations, and the new wealth, virile and uninformed, arising from the flowing profits of government-dependent corporations in the Southwest and the West. So
I thought that was very interesting to point out the massive like state subsidy via the defense industry of like these entire regions, really. Like Texas and Southern California, that's very, you know, Pynchon kind of territory there of like Orange County and Lockheed and Hughes and like NASA and all these, you know, Huntsville, Alabama and Florida. And yeah, also like it does, I mean, I don't know, like you think that kind of, that shouts like Elon Musk to you?
Well, you know, thinking about like the interest in space and how that's, you know, moved to, he's kind of like a huge person involved in space now. I mean, it kind of like moved solely to the private sector for a while, but I think that he's like very much integrated with you know, public funding.
He's like largely bankrolled, I think, off like DoD contracts to launch satellites into space and things like that. So that's kind of still his bread and butter. Like you can't really separate these guys from, it's like, you know, Amazon running the CIA's like cloud computing, you know, service and things like that.
So the mention of integrated. Like space, you know, especially I think
another frontier.
Exactly. And he even makes that comparison. But I think, he represents like the true like cowboyification or the hypertrophized cowboyification of space. You know, and he really is like a true space cowboy in a way, like with this like, you know, naive attitude, like, you know, towards the whole, like, I saw something on Twitter of like all this like debris like scattered or like all over, like, you know, someone's, you know, outside where they lived or something, like, you know, it was like a road, but also like a habitat, you know, for animals, and there's just like all this like, you know, like junk from like his busted up rocket or whatever, just like, you know, strewn everywhere, and like people in the you know, like the original tweet was saying something like, you know, oh, thanks for like, you know, blocking the road and like destroying all these animals, like, you know, habitats, and the people in the comments were like, he has done more to like reach the human potential of space, you know, he's turning us green, and you know, it's like, and people are like, well, how do the rockets help fight global warming? And they're like, well, they don't, but it's just important. It's just important to go to space because of like dreams and imagination, you know. Yeah, exactly.
They just all want to go to Mars in a bucket and live.
They want to go to Mars in a bucket and live on the red planet and worship Shaitan. But anyway,
anyways,
he does say, you know, in a footnote, he notes like, you know, that this is like a new configuration, but that there always is a power struggle theory of some kind from the beginning, and there's always been a split at the top. He mentions the uses of anti-slavery, which is, you know, I guess George M. Frederickson reviewed it, or he wrote a review entitled that of David Bryan Davis's book, The Problem of Slavery, and, you know, the summary of Davis's book via Frederickson, via Oglesby, is the consummation of the United States was not merely a sectional compromise, but also a compact between two distinct elites, a northern capitalist class that increasingly recognized the advantages of a free labor system, and a southern planter class already implicitly committed to the preservation and extension of slavery. Hence, the United States seemingly emerged from its revolutionary period without a national ruling class. It was, in fact, a federation of two regional ruling classes. So that's the parallel that he makes, although, like, not necessarily drawing, like, a genealogical link between, you know, the cowboys and the slave elites, you know. It's, like, it's still the same fragmentation of the ruling class.
It's interesting. In a certain kind of way, it's like the Southern elites, I mean, they weren't entirely vanquished, but they were kind of they were definitely taken down a notch and then forced to like kind of reorient to a new system. And in a way, the Western by the early 20th century, really like the second most powerful faction, which was kind of had overlap with the older Southern planter elites, but was like not exactly the same. Was the Western tycoons, and I mean, definitely Oglesby kind of focuses more on it's like the Southwestern and the Northeastern are kind of and then, you know, in the middle of the country, maybe it's a little more fluid or whatever, but those are the two most powerful blocks. And so, it wasn't a direct line per se from, I don't know, defense contractor, like real estate tycoons in, you know, Southern California, like coming straight from the postbellum South or whatever. A lot of times they were just like primitive accumulators or con men, like John D. Rockefeller's dad, or, you know, just like a bunch of Daniel Plainviews coming out there who, you know, got that first mover's advantage, right, or the early adopter advantage, because that's really if you want to like hop in the fast lane and get a lot of power in this capitalist system very fast, you find a new untapped market where you could like primitively accumulate before anybody else gets there. It's just like if you bought 10,000 Bitcoin in 2010, like you would be like a billionaire now. You know, it's like that kind of thing. But they're always trying to like come up with and I'm sure the same thing applies for space. It applied for the internet, like electronics, et cetera, and certainly for like land, real estate in general. But yeah.
Come on, everybody, we're gonna sing Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Hey, Yankee Doodle, keep it up. Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and we let girls be handy. Father and I went down to camp along with Captain Gooden, and there we saw the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. Hey, Captain Washington upon a strapping stallion, giving orders to his men. I guess there were a million.
Real quick, because I think we're going to jump into like the first tentpole of this book, which is the JFK assassination. But before that, I think Oglesby lays out kind of three major events that preceded the events of the 1960s and 1970s with this kind of Yankee-Cowboy dialectical, really first kind of like almost like a popular front, a bourgeois popular front, if you will, during World War II, but then like the seeds being laid for kind of competing factions. So he lays out three things, one of which we already talked about, which was the long-term penetration of the American foreign policy bureaucracy by a secret group of Anglophiles operating worldwide as the Round Table. So that's, CFR, probably Averell Harriman, Dulles Brothers, etc. But number two is the so-called Operation Underworld of the World War II years, a secret but evidently formal and binding compact linking the federal police apparatus and the crime syndicate of Meyer Lansky. And the third one is, and this is really kind of the most spicy and dark and fascinating one, but the secret submission of the U.S. World War II command to the astonishing demands of Nazi Germany's top spy master, General Reinhard Gehlen, who leapt from Hitler's sinking general staff to become unrivaled chief of American, West German, and NATO intelligence systems in the Cold War years. And he goes into depth both on Operation Underworld, which comes up in strange ways, like in both the milieu of people around the JFK assassination and the people around Watergate. And for anybody that doesn't know, I feel like a lot of people do, so we don't need to spend like too much time on the World War II thing. But basically, there was a lot of sabotage going on in the docks on the East Coast in the early years of World War II. And I guess FDR wanted to put a stop to it, and they ended up turning to the mafia, basically. Mm-hmm. And at that time, Lucky Luciano was in prison, and his nationwide crime syndicate was being run by his Jewish lieutenant, Meyer Lansky. So, apparently the U.S. government approached Meyer Lansky and came up with an agreement basically whereby they would enforce, they would protect the docks from Nazi or fascist Italian espionage and sabotage and things of that nature. And in return, at the end of the war, they would release Lucky Luciano from prison and exile him back to Sicily. And that's basically exactly what happened. At the end of the war, they did deport him, Luciano, back to Sicily, but then he quickly, I think, circled back and landed in their new kind of offshore capital, which was Havana, Cuba, because I guess going back even before World War II, Lansky had a sit-down with Batista, I think the first time he was in power, in 1934, the year of repeal when Prohibition ended, and I guess they had met in 1934. Lansky had seen that the coming legalization of liquor might give an enormous business opportunity to those who had run it when it was illegal. So as repeal drew near, he started shopping for raw material sources for all the world like a run-of-the-mill corporate imperial businessman. He got to Havana in 1934, shortly after Batista first won power. The two men found themselves in deep harmony. Lansky stayed 3 weeks and worked out with Batista the arrangements that would bring molasses from Cuban cane to syndicate-controlled distilleries and set up Havana as a major gaming capital in the Western Hemisphere. From these beginnings, the Lansky-Batista association prospered greatly over the next decade. And I guess in 1944, Roosevelt actually wanted Batista to step aside, and he sent Meyer Lansky to Cuba to ask him to step down. And I think he went and lived in Palm Springs for a while, and then he came back to power, I think in the early 50s, when the U.S. decided they wanted him back. Lansky gave him a Palm Springs mansion to live in, Batista, during the rest of the 1940s. And Lansky told Batista he could go back and take power in the early 50s. So that's what he did. So that just goes to show you the deep level of mafia integration with the regime that Castro overthrew. The one other thing that had implications was that right at the close of the war, the forces of crime in France were integrated into U.S. efforts to establish anti-communist post-war governments, notably at Marseille, where the World War II CIA, the OSS, employed Corsican syndicate goon squads to break the French Communist Party's control of the docks. It was another twisted situation. The main serious wartime resistance to European fascism was that of European communists. The resistance was militarily and therefore politically significant. Beyond Communist Party activity, resistance to Nazi Germany had been fragmentary or weak-willed and ineffectual. The non-communist left, e.g. the groups around Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, the pedo-socialists, had prestige but little combat or political organizational capability. The rest of the country collaborated. With no interference from outside, the natural result of this disposition of factors in post-war Europe might easily have been the immediate rise of the Communist Party to great power, if not dominance, in French affairs. The same thing was threatening to happen all across Europe. Given that American policy was committed to the achievement of a non-communist post-war Western Europe, there was possibly no way for the pacification effort to have avoided collusion with crime. Besides, he italicizes this, besides the Corsican syndicate, there was no other group sufficiently organized and disciplined to challenge the French CP for control of the Marseille docks. A result is that Marseille became within a few years the heroin manufacturing capital of the Western world and the production base of the Lansky-Luciano Trafficante heroin traffic into the American ghetto. So there you go. That's kind of how that happened. He says that, like, with Operation Underworld, Roosevelt made the mafiosi all but official masters of the U.S. East Coast docks and gave implicit protection to their activities everywhere. With his instructions to Patton in 1943, he told Patton to wave the black and yellow banner of the mafia underneath the American flag when he invaded, and ordered him to restore the mafia to power in Sicily. And when he sent Lansky to Batista in 1944, he paved the way for the spread of syndicate influence throughout the Caribbean and Central America. When he directed the CIA to use syndicate thugs at Marseille, I think he means OSS, to use syndicate thugs at Marseille in 1945, he licensed the heroin factories that would be feeding the American habit into a contagion virtually unchecked over the years of the Cold War. The other thing that he pops up, which will come back during Watergate, there's a very bizarre story with young Richard Nixon during the war, and it involves the black market economy around, like, bootleg tires in Miami, which I guess because there's rationing, the mafia got into this whole secondary market of selling used tires, which was illegal. And I guess Nixon's career is very weird because he worked for the office of, I forget what it was called. It was like a very obscure war office. He had the Office of Price Administration. He worked in the interpretations unit before joining the Navy in the first year of the war, and he was in the tire rationing branch. And investigator Jeff Girth has discovered that 3 weeks after Nixon began this job, his close friend-to-be, George Smathers, came to federal court for the defendant in this case, United States v. Standard Oil of Kansas, Rockefeller. U.S. Customs had confiscated a load of American-made tires, re-entering the country through Cuba in an, quote, attempt to circumvent national tire rationing, i.e. bootleg tires. Smathers wanted to speed up the case for his client, and so wrote to the OPA for a ruling. His letter must have come to Nixon, who, OPA records show, was responsible for all correspondence on tire rationing questions. It was therefore Nixon's business to answer Smathers. Especially since this was the first knock on the door, it would be nice to know what Nixon said and how the matter was disposed of. Unfortunately, reports Girth, most OPA records were destroyed after the war. He hypothesized that maybe that Nixon became friendly with Cuban mafioso Bebe Rebozo around this time, even though allegedly the real story is that Nixon was introduced to Bebe Rebozo by Richard Danner, the courier and connector who left the FBI to become city manager of Miami Beach at a time when it was under the all but open control of the mob. Danner met Nixon at a party in 1947, thrown in Washington by another newly elected congressman, George Smathers, who was an intimate friend and business partner of Bebe Rebozo and a friend of Batista. Yeah, there was like a lot of like just connections of them getting like comped at casinos and getting money, and even like the Checkers scandal was wrapped up in this. Anyways, like he lays this out basically that there was like full integration of the organized crime apparatus and the law enforcement apparatus. So that's like one that will continuously pop up in both JFK and Watergate. Now the second one, or the third thing he lists, is kind of the most ominous, and that is about the Gehlen organization. I think he does actually a really good job here of like summarizing Gehlen, and he He summarizes some other things that I don't think this was his intention, but just I think people will recognize a kind of interesting line that he takes on some of the Soviet collaborators in the Red Army that, I'll just read this and you can draw your own conclusion. Okay. So Oglesby writes, recall two generals of World War II. First, General Andrei Vlasov, a Red Army officer secretly working with an extensive anti-Bolshevist spy ring. Oh, I thought it was all just made up by Stalin. Okay. He joined up his forces with the advancing Germans during the invasion of Ukraine, where Russian forces antagonistic to Stalin and anxious to overthrow the Bolsheviks had collected. Vlasov commanded the so-called Army of Liberation, a full division of more or less well-equipped troops fighting under the flag of Great White Russian Reaction for the restoration of the Tsar. And second, General Reinhard Gehlen, the famous super spy of the same war, master of Hitler's powerful Soviet intelligence apparatus. The practical basis of the great success of Gehlen's Soviet intelligence system was his relationship to Vlasov. Through Vlasov, Gehlen had access to the Russian anti-Bolshevist underground network that had long since penetrated, if not captured, key departments of the Soviet regime. Is everyone getting scared yet? At a moment in their invasion, when the Nazis still thought themselves on the brink of triumph, Gehlen proposed to Hitler that Vlasov be made the head of the forthcoming provisional government. No support for that provisional government. No support, to quote Lenin. Hitler declined, presumably out of respect for Vlasov's power, but the relationship between Gehlen and Vlasov and their spy systems remained intact, even after the defeat of the Wehrmacht at the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 42 and 43. By Christmas 1944, Gehlen had reached the belief that Germany's cause was hopeless. Against the certainty of national defeat, he decided that his only personal choice lay between surrender to the Russians and surrender to the Americans. In 1945, with the Russian army closing on Berlin, Gehlen gathered together with his top aides in a hotel room in Bad Elster, Saxony, to carry out the decisive and most dangerous step of their decision. They stripped their archives of the intelligence information that would be most useful to them in subsequent negotiations. Burning tons of other documents, they stored their basic intelligence cache in 52 crates, and with elaborate security measures moved these crates south into the Bavarian Redoubt and buried them in a high mountain field called Misery Meadow, overlooked by a chalet which Gehlen's foresight had long before provisioned. Safe there with his top 40 aides and his buried spy treasures, Gehlen settled down to wait the Americans. By May Day 1945, the Red Army was in Berlin and Hitler was dead. Well, maybe dead. 3 weeks later, columns of the 101st Airborne moved up the valley below Gehlen's mountain fortress. Gehlen's aides descended from the upper slopes to present themselves for capture and arrange an appointment for the capture of their commander, the highest-ranking German officer and Hitler's only staff general yet to make his way to safety in American hands. No ceremonies were slighted. One interview followed another. Captured in May, Gehlen arrived in Washington 3 months later, August 22, 1945, in the uniform of a general of the United States Army, flown there in the command transport of General Walter Bedell Smith, who I believe was the first CIA director, shortly thereafter, in a series of secret meetings with the American staff, beginning with Allen Dulles and Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS. He laid out in detail the proposal, the surrender conditions, essentially, which he was offering the Americans. Post-war Europe, he pointed out, as everyone knew, was certain to become the arena of a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, ultimately even greater than the confrontation just ending between the victorious Allies and the vanquished Axis. The Soviets, he said, were well prepared for this new confrontation from an intelligence standpoint, as who better than he could say, and the Americans were not. The Russians had a crack spy network in West Europe and America, but the Americans did not have a spy network of any kind or quality in East Europe and Russia. Did that not put Americans at an imported disadvantage in the forthcoming struggles? Then where and how could the Americans procure the needed capability? Recruiting and training a corps of Russian and Central European intelligence agents and building a network of reliable sources and experts nearly from scratch would take years, generations. The Americans agreed with Gehlen that they did not have much time. Very well, Gehlen had a practical solution to this very problem. His own intelligence apparatus was still intact within the collapsing Hitler government. It was as capable as ever of delivering large masses of high-quality intelligence data on all aspects of Soviet life. Hitler had never taken advantage of this capability, Gehlen explained. Hitler had ignored Gehlen's organization and had gone on to ruin. Still, it was there. It might have been put to better use. It still could be, should the Americans accept his offer. Gehlen's offer was for the Americans to pick up his organization bodily and bolt it into the empty space in their own intelligence system as though it were one of the spoils of the war. Gehlen could plausibly guarantee his network's unmatched and unbending loyalty to the cause of anti-Bolshevism, and the 52 crates he had buried in Misery Meadow were tangible proofs of his power and a foretaste of secret knowledge to come. All the Americans had to do was meet Gehlen's 4 conditions. These are pretty wild. First, Gehlen was to have complete autonomy within his organization and total control over its activities. The Americans would tell him what they wanted, and they would get it, satisfaction guaranteed, but they would have to know nothing about the process by which Gehlen got it to give them. That knowledge was Gehlen's own. He even reserved the right to approve U.S. liaison officers assigned to him. Second, the Americans would agree to use Gehlen only against the USSR and the East European satellites. Third, when a new German government was set up, the Americans would constitutionally install the Gehlen organization in it as its official central intelligence agency and cancel automatically all outstanding Gehlen commitments to the United States. Fourth, the Americans would never require Gehlen to do anything he considered against German national interest. In the long and short, our guys fell for it. Even as the United States was publicly proclaiming a policy of unconditional German surrender, Gehlen's incredible conditions were met, and his organization was being established at the very core and seat of the American system of foreign intelligence under the responsibility of Allen Dulles' secret intelligence branch of the OSS. By the time of the transformation of the OSS into the CIA in 1948, Gehlen had grown tight with Dulles, and his organization had become, in effect, the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. Soon after the formation of NATO, it became the official NATO intelligence organization. Cool. As per Gehlen's third condition, his organization was installed as the core, and he is the director of the West German CIA, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND. Sorry for butchering that. And, basically, he said, we need to go no further into the exploits of this last long and probable phase of Gehlen's career, save to note that it spans the Cold War, that it was current as of Watergate, and that Gehlen had to be pried out of a spy's, quote, retirement in 1974 to testify in the sensational West German spy scandal that brought down Willy Brandt. Look what powers the victors conceded the vanquished. Exclusive purveyor of intelligence on the Soviet Union and East Europe to the United States, West Germany, and NATO, Gehlen, in the spirit kept alive in him and his staff, had more power over official American perceptions in the post-war world than even a German victory could have given them. The Gehlen-Vlasov intelligence system had become a main source and fountain of official American consciousness. And last thing, going back to Vlasov, behold the span of this concatenation. First, in the time of Trotsky, relevant, there is General Vlasov and his anti-Bolshevist army and spy ring. The Vlasov apparatus is then, at a certain later point, assimilated to the Gehlen apparatus. Then, just as the White Russian spies jumped to the Nazis when their own army went down, so now the German Nazi and Russian Tsarist spies together jumped to the American army as the Wehrmacht was falling. Vlasov first became a department of Gehlen, then Gehlen became a department of Allen Dulles. This is how it came to pass that a Tsarist spy ring inside a Nazi spy ring took up the inner seats in the American foreign policy intelligence apparatus at the precise moment that this apparatus was starting to come forward as a major player in the great policy wars of Washington and the world. This is how it came to pass that everything official Washington would know about the Soviet Union and East Europe on most believable report, everything about the enemy our policymakers would most confidently believe, would come by way of Tsarists and Nazis installed at the center of our national intelligence system. That was a buzzard that would come home to roost again and again. So there you go. I mean, so, first of all, I don't know. According to Oglesby, who is no Stalinist, the Vlasov spy ring was extremely vast. It does make me wonder, though, how'd they miss Vlasov? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
You mean, like, how did the Soviets miss Vlasov? Yeah, I don't know.
Because he was literally, like, the kind of person they were searching for.
Yeah.
Like, he was literally collaborating with the Nazis and had a plan to, like, kill Stalin and, like, restore the Tsarist government. And he did have, I've read about his army before. What was it called? Army of Liberation, I think. Mm-hmm. And how I think some of them, Andrei Vlasov, just to check on him, Yeah, they were mostly ethnic Russians. I wasn't sure if maybe they were mostly Ukrainians, but I think they did have a lot of Ukrainians. I guess he got captured and then agreed to collaborate with them. See, it's interesting. When you read Wikipedia, it makes it sound like he's a guy who just sort of got captured and then changed his mind. Mm-hmm. But then the way it's kind of said here is like, no, he was spying for them, and he was, sympathetic basically to the overthrow of the Bolsheviks, and basically wanted to Vlasov was hanged in Moscow in 1946, so I mean they got him, folks. They eventually got him, but it is pretty it's interesting how it actually gives a little bit more credence to some of the more spectacular claims. Maybe not so much of like the old Bolshevik party members, but definitely. Oh, why am I blanking on the general Tukhachevsky? Marshal Tukhachevsky in 1937, which was actually a secret trial, not a public trial. So that all that is a pretty good summary of like the Gehlen org and how they integrated themselves extremely deep. I mean, really, it is kind of, I like that sort of characterization of it, of just there's like an empty space that they took this spy network and just plugged it into this gap that they had, because it makes sense. Like they really didn't have any intelligence assets really inside of Eastern Europe. At the end of World War II, they were kind of shit out of luck. So if they wanted to launch this kind of global Cold War, and of course, as we see time and again, really not that opposed to working with some pretty bad Nazis overall.
Yeah, Oglesby's like analysis of that is like kind of like a little bit spotty, because he's like, they were tricked basically. Like our guys were gullible and like they fell for it. They stumbled into a Cold War. Exactly. Like according to him, like they weren't even trying to set up a Cold War. It was just like they were taken by surprise by the alliance deteriorating. So
I think even though elsewhere he attacks the kind of idea of like bumbling CIA narratives around things like the Bay of Pigs in I think a very deft way. I think maybe I don't think he quite goes full bumbling deep state, but maybe, I mean, ultimately he condemns the American ruling class, basically. But I know what you mean. Like, this is how it came to pass that a Tsar spy ring inside a Nazi spy ring took up the inner seats. I think he's right about everything he says there, and how everything we would come to know about the enemy would come through these, like, Nazis and these psychos. But I think that for people like Alan Dulles, that I don't know how much they really cared. And in fact, they might have recognized like the utility of that. Basically, because they talk about later how certain things were Kennedy, like the way they would twist intelligence and stuff to like give a certain impression to him. Like they were.
Yeah, I guess like it's. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting take in a way, because it's kind of like, what does it mean to, like, trust someone? Like, they know what their worldview was, so, like, is trusting them really gullible, or do they just agree with them?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, are they just also wrong? And do they, like, just trust the information they're receiving from them, not because they're naive about who they are, but because, like, they have a similar worldview? Like,
yes, exactly. Well, I think he does point out the most critical thing is that you knew you could rely on these guys, if nothing else. Like, Nazis are duplicitous, but the one thing you could rely on them is their fanatical hatred of Bolshevism. Like, they're not going to like turn double agent on you and start working for the KGB. Probably. I mean, perhaps it happened once or twice, but I would say that people like Gehlen, like they were diehards. So you had that kind of, you knew you had the like rock hard ideological, compatibility that, well, the enemy is my butt, is my asset. That's totally cool. And I think by the end of the war, it's like, we did crush them. So I think it was, in some ways, I think it was maybe more of like a One Ring thing. Like, oh, you could just like, hang all these guys for their war crimes, or you could like keep them and maybe they could be really useful, and like what's the worst that could happen? I think with people like Alan Dulles, who definitely strikes me as a bit of like a psychopath, like, or a sociopath. Maybe he wouldn't even think that much about it, but I'm sure other people could probably, psychologically bargain with themselves and say like, well, they're only dangerous to our new enemy. They're not really dangerous to us anymore. Like we beat them because we're number one, and so why not use these guys? What's the big deal, even the Nazis practiced this kind of thing of like, oh, the Holocaust, like, oh, I didn't know anything about that, like I was just building rockets, like that kind of thing.
And people might not have really understood at that time. They might not have like had it's still like a transitional period. Like there definitely was like an engine of wartime propaganda like churning, but at the same time like the specter of like the Nazi as like this extremely bad thing that you can't possibly deal with. Like, a lot of people in the United States like were down with the Nazis like at first, after the fact,
Oglesby also talks about how like the weird trajectory of John F. Kennedy and how his father, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UK in the late 1930s, like that kind of had that was an interesting influence on, for Joseph Kennedy, who kind of came up as like this Irish bootlegger from Boston, who was not really considered old society by the Boston Brahmin types. He really fell in hard with like the British aristocracy when he was ambassador, and also was like a huge isolationist and was like very against the United States getting involved in combating Nazi Germany. And Oglesby points out, a lot of the British aristocracy at that time was like, I mean, maybe he's even being like too optimistic about like the common British people, but basically saying that like they were out of step with like their own population of like the common people at that time, and a lot of them like really admired Hitler, so they were so spellbound by like the sort of the myth of his like military prowess that he said they were spiritually incapable of opposing Nazism, and Joseph Kennedy kind of like adopted that line like fully. And I guess even like JFK's college dissertation was about, I think it might have been about like being an isolationist or something, but I guess it was just like a total regurgitation of his father's political beliefs when he was a young man. But.
Yeah. He found that buckle in a pawn shop, can't two-step across this floor. Them boots ain't ever seen the mud, can't be what you're looking for. Got a half-ass smile and fake southern drawl. He's dressed up like the Marlboro Man. He's never backed in a box, dropped in a shoot, and he's never rode for a brand. 'Cause he ain't a cowboy, he ain't a plowboy, he's just a city boy in disguise. And he's never drove a tractor, maybe that's the kind of man you're after. And he can't saddle up no horse, so he ain't ever gonna ride away. I'm a saddle sore puncher and a buckle I want, sure to break your heart one day. He's never pulled no plow from dusk till dawn, or thrown hay till the sun came up. He's never hooked no bass on a Texas rig, hell the man don't drive a truck. And he'll be out across town tomorrow night in skinny jeans 'cause he has no shame. He's never tipped his hat for guts or glory or riding through the pain. 'Cause he ain't a cowboy, he ain't a plowboy, he's just a city boy in disguise. And he's never drove a tractor, maybe that's the kind of man you're after. He can't saddle up no horse, so he ain't ever gonna ride away. And I'm a saddle sore puncher and a buckle I want, sure to break your heart one day.
But we can move on to like Kennedy now that all those stages are set just a little bit. We don't need to talk. I think we all know Magic Bullet is bullshit. Warren Commission bullshit. I think that one thing that we talked about earlier that this book does cover is a little bit of a pushback against our boy Saint Gnome, who insisted that JFK was just like a bloodthirsty militarist. Like there's absolutely no difference between him and Johnson, and thus this assassination just doesn't matter.
Right.
I think,
yeah.
Right.
There's some good quotes there. I definitely don't agree with Chomsky's idea. It doesn't matter. I think it's hard to say, like, with a president, like, what would have happened, like, if he had lived. So I feel like there's a little bit of, like, projection or extrapolation with, like, Kennedy, but a lot of it is persuasive. Like, we should definitely go into it. And I definitely don't think there's no difference, in this book, in this formulation, there's like a huge difference because Johnson is like a cowboy aligned.
Yes, I was just gonna say, that's an important thing that people, certainly Chomsky doesn't pick up on at all. That even though these guys were in the same party, they were both demon rats. They embodied. The Democratic Party was like a very bizarre coalition of different voting blocks and interests in like the mid 20th century during the Cold War. Like it truly was. It was a very broad but strange coalition of like increasingly like African American voters, white racist segregationists, like white ethnic union people in the North and the Midwest, and like Jewish liberals in New York. You know what I mean? Like just like a really, but like the presence of the Dixiecrats, which is what Johnson. I mean, he's kind of a Dixiecrat, but actually not actually technically, because he was supportive, at least, publicly, and I guess in his legislation of civil rights. But what he really was like I'd say in economic terms, he was a cowboy because he was super plugged in with all of the military, industrial, defense contractor stuff that was happening in Texas. And I believe when he was in the Senate, I think he may have been chairman at one point of the Armed Services Committee. He was a chairman of a defense committee, whichever one it was, that oversaw the black budget in the 1950s. So he was like intimate, and he was incredibly corrupt on top of that. And of course, this was like a clumsy kind of attempt at building a kind of, unity ticket. I think the Kennedys had to be kind of bullied a little bit into accepting Johnson. I forget where I read it, but or if it was maybe it was in Evidence of Revision, but that somebody came to the Kennedy brothers, Bobby and Jack, at the convention when they were still trying to decide who they wanted to pick for their VP, and they were leaning towards somebody else, and they both like hated Johnson. They just thought he was an abusive asshole and didn't like trust him or anything like that. And I feel somebody went to them and like kind of threatened to blackmail JFK with like evidence of him committing adultery, and they just had to like kind of suck it up and like pick Johnson, which is I'd have to go check that later. If anybody wants to fact check me, they can do that. But I'm pretty certain that something like that went down, that their arm was twisted. That kind of like with Reagan and like Bush, like getting Bush to be his VP. It was kind of like not a natural match in terms of their disposition.
Obama and Biden. If you think back at the time, everyone was saying it was going to be Hillary, and I guess maybe she was given the choice, is what I had always heard. But I don't know.
Interesting. She wasn't going to play second fiddle. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, or the vice president doesn't do anything.
That's true. Really. She knows that. Yeah, and also I think there was a very like savvy, tactical, like we want to put like an old white guy, like an old Irish Catholic, like Scranton Joe.
Well, he's like a John McCain equivalent. Yeah, or like optically speaking, he was
exactly
like
demographically all that shit. But I think like Oglesby quotes a lot of people. I guess these aren't like the serious aids that Chomsky, like Schlesinger and people like that like changed their biographies in the late 60s to sound more anti-Vietnam, but it was all a lie. The end. Don't look into it. He goes into like the very Obama-esque doctrine of like special war that Kennedy was, and Kennedy and like his Atlanticist kind of brethren were interested
very
in.
Like, we'll use a scalpel or whatever,
exactly. And also like he talks about kind of like the interesting hedging that liberals did, talking about like they're kind of hemming and hawing about the Bay of Pigs and how they're not really like totally against it on principle, but they're kind of they're skeptical that it will be like a net positive for basically and I guess some of these liberals also tried to like influence the Bay of Pigs operation. There's a really funny anecdote from Tad Schultz that's relayed when Howard Hunt was summoned to the Washington CIA office from Guatemala to like for a Bay of Pigs meeting, and told that Manuel Rey, a liberal anti-Castroite, was going to be placed on the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the exile group's leadership committee, and he objected strongly to being instructed to put land reform in the new Cuban constitution he was drafting. So like Howard Hunt's writing the new Cuban constitution, but then they're like, hey, what if we put some like land reform? Schultz said, with a touch of desperation, Hunt insisted that Rey was proposing Castroism without Fidel. Rey was a quote, a revisionist and an opportunist, but his objections were met with stunning silence from the senior CIA officers assembled in Bissell's office. They had their instructions from the White House. Hunt finally blurted out that he would rather withdraw from the operation than compromise on the issue. To his astonishment, no attempt was made to dissuade him from resigning. This marked the end of Hunt's direct involvement with the Bay of Pigs invasion. So I guess that was like right after Kennedy got into office, like maybe just like weeks before, or a week or two before Bay of Pigs, and he just balked at. So yeah, you see the very obvious thing going on there, but so yeah, there was a kind of weird liberal thing where like the Atlanticists basically they kind of felt that Secretary of State Dean Rusk was Undersecretary of State Bowles, a blood Yankee liberal, stumbled onto the invasion plans as they were hatching, and ran to Secretary of State Rusk to protest. His argument was that, quote, the chances of success are not greater than 1 out of 3. This makes it a highly risky operation. If it fails, Castro's prestige and strength will be greatly enhanced. And Oglesby says in some ways this is what happened, yet the argument seems cynical. Halberstam and Bowles are not actually anti-Castro. Neither one actually wants to see Castro's prestige destroyed. Their argument about counterproductivity seems an easy way to get a desired result, hands off Cuba, in effect, without having to be explicit in the support of the Cuban people's right to revolution, and without having to attack the assumption that the United States has the right to invade country X if only practical standards can be satisfied. So he said that basically, in their mind, a logical Bay of Pigs invasion existed. In other words, it existed in the minds of its advocates. In this logical Bay of Pigs invasion, the President of the United States was to have been a friend, not an enemy. Nixon would have made everything different. With Nixon in command, the bombers would have flown, the assassins would have struck, the fleet would have steamed again into Havana if necessary. But he talks about how the special war period under Kennedy was the link between the commando-style espionage and political action taken under Eisenhower and the full-dressed air, ground, and sea war waged under Johnson. But special war was supposed to lead away from strategic war, not toward it, much as the commando politics of the late Eisenhower period was supposed to avert the necessity of engagement in the higher strategic scale of nuclear big power confrontation. Indeed, each phase of escalation is begun with a definition of aims and limits that looks every bit like a built-in guarantee against the frantic rescue missions that inflame the original problem, but the limit is always defined in terms of a strong initial expectation of positive success. The spy will achieve the objective. The commandos will achieve the objective. The special forces will achieve the objective. The infantry will achieve the objective. The air forces will achieve the objective. But at last, the objective is lost altogether in what becomes the supervening need to rescue the very rescue capability itself. And he says, what was the theory of Kennedy's Special Forces phase? Its chief theoretician, Walt Whitman Rostow, defined communism. This is interesting from like our Paul Robeson episode. Rostow defined communism as, quote, a disease of transition, a social breakdown to which a society is peculiarly susceptible as it experiences the process of modernization. Once across the line, Rostow philosophized, a society again becomes stable, as though industrial life is stable in its natural state, as though there is or has been stability in American or European life. But just at the crossing, there's the temptation to go red, to break faith with the universals of natural rights and free enterprise to the monopolies, and turn the problem of development over to international communism. That is where the special forces come in. They're there to hold the future for U.S. world capitalism across the line of third world social transition. Protected thus from its own transient delirium, Country X can lock into the world system of American technical, i.e. military development assistance and corporate activity activity defined as the free world by those who most prosper in its games. That was the basis of the Alliance for Progress, the Peace Corps, the Special Forces, and the Special War Expedition to Vietnam. Kennedy carried the Rostowian assumptions to their combined conclusion, with an Alliance for Progress reform program depicted as working away at the larger social economic base of the problem. He positions a special forces capability to nip the bud of transitional diseases in the social margin. Nipped, these diseases do not grow into revolutions. Revolutions do not seize the small states one by one and carry them off into the camp of the adversary, and the United States continues to dominate a generally happy and prosperous world sphere, meanwhile easing toward detente in Europe, which really counts. Country X will have been protected from transitional diseases by the American exertions and can float up into the modern world system on a bubble of American aid, mainly in the form of military assistance designed, above all, to secure the local ruling group and thus keep that kind of peace, ultimately to conglomerate with all the other country X's in the happy molecule whose master atom is the multinational corporation. And Oglesby argues, finally, that was the system of special forces Alianza world-making for which Kennedy died. The vision of the Round Table, the CFR, the liberals in the Rockefeller, Morgan, Mellon, Carnegie group. What cost Kennedy his life was his attempt to impose the limits of Camelot Atlanticism on a frontier-minded defense and security elite. His sense of the Cuban and Vietnamese situation seems to have been much the same. In each case, from a practical political standpoint, his immediate adversary was not Cuban or Vietnamese communism, so much as it was the American pro-war power elite to which he was so beholden and exposed. Recall that Kennedy could assume the loyalty of none of the clandestine or armed services, not the FBI, certainly not the CIA, 1,000 times not the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is why it is so important to see the Kennedy administration's record not in terms of its outward rationality, for it has none, and not as the expression of Kennedy's will alone, for his will did not prevail, but in terms of the impassioned political infighting that in reality constituted its actual life. If it is the relations of power in America that speak in Kennedy's apparent formula. If the Cuban exiles can make the invasion alone, let it be done, but only if. Or again, if the Vietnamese threat can be contained with a special forces level commitment and without disrupting North Atlantic relations, let it be done, but only if. Yeah, so then, he goes on to list evidence that Kennedy intended to pull back from Vietnam, particularly after his re-election. And I mean, there's a lot of quotes here that I guess Chomsky didn't consider serious, so they're whatever. But
yeah, there are a couple, there are a couple good ones. People who had mentioned that he had like a big change of mind about Vietnam.
Yeah,
there was one guy in particular who I guess had been speaking against the war extensively, and Kennedy I guess took him aside and was like, I think you're right about Vietnam. It was just like very, very shortly before his death.
It was like maybe a week or two. He said, I keep like, I agree with your attacks on me or something like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in your attacks on me or something. I forget what the name of the guy
Wayne
was.
Who was it? It was Wayne Morse. Yeah, Kennedy told him, Wayne, I want you to know you're absolutely right in your criticism of my Vietnam policy. Keep this in mind. I'm in the midst of an intensive study which substantiates your position of Vietnam, and that apparently was like what became known as the Pentagon Papers later, the McNamara study. And and so I guess like he was looking at that at the time. He also told, let's see, I think it was maybe one of his aides.
Right, yeah, he had a major decision to reject the recommendation made to him by virtually everyone that he send combat units to Vietnam. Kennedy realized that most of the people in the country, whatever their politics, would have said, if it takes combat troops or if it takes heavy bombing and nuclear weapons, it's obviously not worth it to us. We won't succeed. That's what Ellsberg said, summarizing, the McNamara study.
And to Oglesby's credit, he points out later that Ellsberg is sus, and he worked for Ed Lansdale in Southeast Asia, and maybe it was like some kind of weird Atlanticist limited hangout in the early 70s to like fuck with Nixon. But yeah, very, very Ed Snowden kind of vibes going on with Ellsberg. Ellsberg's really the original like friendly spook that comes out and is like heavy air quotes like persecuted, but gets to go on like Democracy Now! And like get a bunch of book deals and like be a celebrity.
I think Oglesby is like pretty careful to like reiterate at least that he doesn't want to take sides in the Yankee-Cowboy War. And he even frames the book in this way of like going into Watergate as well and showing trying to frame this as two sides opposed to each other, and not really like one victimized or one that he supports or roots for. So he hates all these fools, and I think it's good. Unlike LaRouche, who I feel like I don't know if LaRouche like sided with the Cowboys per se, but he I don't know. A lot of people end up like they get caught in the sinister dialectic. LaRouche now, if we're saying Trump is a cowboy, LaRouche is all about Trump. Although it's been a while. Like what I do wonder what LaRouche is up to like right now. Like what's he talking about currently? Like what?
Well, he's dead, so.
Well, like the LaRouche organization. I know. We talked about this during LaRouche.
Like, what is Helga Zepp up to?
Helga Zepp.
I don't know what they're. I feel like that. Like the Joe Biden's infrastructure plan was just announced. It's probably gonna suck, but it feels LaRouche. It feels like there's some LaRouche stirrings in the Biden administration, for better or worse.
LaRouche
maybe not enough trains.
Four top articles are thank you J.S. Bach. Wise up, Mr. Biden. America is a republic, not a democracy. And the American system, realignment of the United States, and the picture of that last headline is a picture of Lincoln, LaRouche, and Trump, like in a triptych.
Like a Marx Lenin,
Yes.
Wow, that's great. Okay, so they're off on their cloud. Ooh, here's another quote, though, that Kennedy said to his aide, Kenneth O'Donnell, in 1963. This one, I would like to see the context of this, because it so boldly refutes Chomsky. Kennedy apparently said, in 1965, I'll become one of the most unpopular presidents in history. I'll be damned everywhere as a communist appeaser, but now I don't care. If I tried to pull out completely now from Vietnam, we would have another Joe McCarthy Red Scare on our hands, but I can do it after I'm reelected. So we had better make damn sure I'm reelected.
I remember seeing that. According to whom did he say that?
Kenneth O'Donnell. It is footnoted. I haven't checked the footnote.
We should check the footnote because that's quite a statement. It's
wonder, a bold one.
To his aide Kenneth O'Donnell, he remarked this. All right, this is we're gonna.
What? Let's see. What chapter was that in? Chapter 4.
It's note number 24. Yeah.
In chapter 4.
In chapter 4.
Let's see. Let's see.
I'm sure it's not going to be a satisfying note, but I'm looking. Yeah.
It looks like it says Hearings, Volume 25, page 244, Commission Exhibit 1268. I wonder if that was the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
Hearings, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, I guess is that the same as? Was the Warren hearings? Interesting.
Yeah, because he cites it just above. So
interesting. Wow. So stuff like that was said during the Warren Commission. There was plenty that wasn't said during the Warren Commission.
There's certainly enough evidence, for us to speculate that it might have mattered somewhat. For us to put the point to Chomsky, when he comes on the podcast to beg for execution and to take Shahada,
he can maybe attempt to clear the record in his name.
Yeah, some of these possibilities.
Also, not just the whole Vietnam thing, but even if you wanted to be generous and give Chomsky that, then Oglesby goes through and lists like not just Vietnam stuff, but all the other things he was kind of doing in the economic sphere that were pissing off various people, like saying that he was going to cancel the oil depletion allowance.
Right. Yes, that was a big thing.
What was he doing? Was he putting price controls on steel as well?
It was a bunch of things that were like attacks on them, like.
His assault on the sanctity of the defense budget.
Yeah.
He had the audacity to slightly reduce the defense budget from $51.6 billion to $50.8.
Right, defense contractors, that's like cowboy territory, basically. In
big cowboy territory.
Framework.
And, MIT territory. And...
Right, yeah. There's also the Chomsky faction as well.
He was also going after Jimmy Hoffa. Robert Kennedy was going after Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters and getting a little dangerously threatening to expose and destroy a major and basic sphere of syndicate activity, the Teamster Pension Fund complex. He also announced in April 1963 that all U.S. raids on Cuba would stop. There's an interesting anecdote here from Detective Sergeant C.H. Sapp of the Miami Police Intelligence Unit, who said about anti-Castro Cubans in Miami, for the last 3 days, the intelligence unit has been receiving information concerning the feelings and proposed actions of the Cuban refugee colony Miami. Since President Kennedy made the news release that the United States government would stop all raiding parties going against Castro's government, the Cuban people feel that the U.S. government has turned against them. All violence hitherto directed towards Castro's Cuba will now be directed towards various governmental agencies in the U.S. Wow, they're just such sovereign citizens. It's so cool. Also, Kennedy also ordered, in September 1963, he ordered the FBI to raid secret CIA guerrilla training camps and staging bases in Florida and Louisiana. Probably the one Graham Parsons visited with like his stepdad. And Dave Ferry, our favorite wandering bishop, linked by Jim Garrison to Clay Shaw and the CIA, was involved in the operation of the Louisiana camps. The camps are situated on land owned by a gambling associate of Jack Ruby's, Bill McClaney. The McClaney brothers, Coggs, and the Lansky Syndicate were among the big losers when the Cuban Revolution ejected the syndicate and its casinos from the island. That's like, it really does, it goes on and on and on. There's like so much pointing that and again, not to like valorize Kennedy as like, oh, he was like the best president ever and like he was going to be so great and just do everything good and they killed him, and you know what I mean? Because like Kennedy was, I think, far from perfect, and he was still, as Oglesby says, still an imperialist at the end of the day. But there was a little bit of a different framing that I think was dominant in sort of the Northeastern Atlanticist establishment. Mainly, a lot of them, and we brought this up in our Victory episode, like just how many of the prominent kind of Sovietologists and leading intellectual lights and economists and things like that thought it was absolutely ridiculous that the Soviet Union would ever collapse, and that it's kind of it's kind of like what I read about the Bay of Pigs thing. It's like we should help revolutionaries like storm the island in the Bay of Pigs, storm Cuba, and help them, but only if like we can do it with that limited commitment. Like if we have to do more than that, it's not worth it. It's kind of like that. It's like they perceive the cost, it seemed. They perceive the cost of like directly confronting the Soviet Union or actively trying to like undermine it and cause its collapse as just like way too high of a cost to even consider trying. So we're going to have to live with this for a while, and maybe we can kind of still, but they weren't giving up their dream of like integrated global capitalism. They just thought, sometimes you got to pick your battles.
A different strategy, or maybe the value of a defeated Soviet Union wasn't quite as great. For them, like maybe they had a way of achieving their goals. Maybe like integrated global capitalism, there's other ways to achieve it, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, like there's other
also their
I don't know,
their heavy focus on the centrality of like Western Europe as basically like our main ally, and it's like if you lose Western Europe to the communists, then you're really screwed. Like I think for them that was the existential fear, is that like France and maybe the UK and all these people would like drop out of NATO and become socialists and just be like, we don't want anything to do with you barbaric American like bloodthirsty imperialist dogs. So we had to keep up a certain amount of appearances.
It's interesting when you really extrapolate this, because like you think about it, like it's interesting to like kind of type the presidents and stuff, but once you get down to like the lower level, like when you're talking about Sovietologists and like academics and things like that, and where like they fall like in this alignment, because certainly, like, I think that it's much more, precise and accurate to talk about these as, like, formulations of power, but a lot of people, within the ruling elite, but there's a lot of structures embedded in those power formations, like universities and stuff, and, they produce ideas and everything. So,
Totally.
yeah, like...
you got the whole cultural Cold War like apparatus going on as well.
Yeah, exactly. Like, is it maybe like a cultural, is the cultural aspect of things, maybe something like, sponsoring modern art or whatever. Like, that's maybe more of like an Atlanticist type strategy, or like a Yankee type idea.
It is. Like a perverted Yankee idea of like Tony Podesta's art collection, like that super Atlanticist.
Something like that. Yeah. I'm thinking now about the two mics and like, he's gotta do martial law. He's got, it's gonna happen any day now. He just has to do it. Versus like.
Well, Oglesby quotes like a lot of he quotes some interesting stuff from Miles Copeland, the famous CIA guy we brought up before like some of him speaking in the early 70s and kind of formulating the way him talking about the future and how America is probably going to tend, or really every modern country is going to start trending towards totalitarian control of their populations, because he was predicting an epidemic of left-wing
internet, actually, or at least like computerization in some way. Like,
I think that that was a liberal that he was referencing, who was like talking about the dangers of like technocratic fascism or something.
Maybe techno-fascism.
But what he actually was like, but Copeland was saying that there's going to be an epidemic of like probably the USSR and its allies just mashing the support left terrorism button over and over again, and there's just going to be left terrorism all over the world, and that basically people are going to beg for the government to like apply these like more heavy-handed type of security state measures like they did in the 60s. And that people are gonna like it and sleep well at night, when this happens. And Oglesby's kind of grossed out by it.
Right. The National Review will demand for order, sleep, silence.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. He's
also,
right. Yeah, he's.
Also, in terms of just like a side note on Kennedy and Castro, there's a little interesting thing here about that reminded me of Paul Robeson's speech at the Paris Peace Conference in 1949, when he talks about the translations of Castro's speeches that were used in White House briefings and also in like world press and like the American press. And these two authors, one was Bob Scheer, they established that in the Kennedy White House, the CIA translator was either naive about the Spanish language or intentionally changed Castro's meaning. Uniformly, the CIA translations being presented to Schlesinger and the Kennedys for analysis made Castro sound harsher and more belligerent than he was, encouraging the picture of a tyrant governing against popular will. This played, Oglesby argues, into a wider concert of Hunt-style disinformation being orchestrated from somewhere outside the Oval Office, with the purpose of making the Oval Office, the Kennedy brothers, think Castro had an unstable popular base and would be overthrown by the Cuban people if the United States would show support. So that's kind of interesting that it's like, well, I mean, they were being psyoped themselves by people like E. Howard Hunt, who were now I want to go back and read. I want to double check like every single translation of like a communist leader that I've ever read on like Wikipedia or something, because like how often did they really do this, where every time they translate you from a foreign language, it's like kill like every bourgeois pig, like we're gonna steal your families, everyone's gonna wear a gray jumpsuit, and like we hate lifeblood, like hail Satan, you know what I mean? Like like just how we saw with Robeson, where he was like speaking pretty tactfully and diplomatically and stuff, like knowing that he might be reprinted in America, and they just like turned him into like a Portland Antifa edgelord, like circa 2020. It was just like, we deserve all your wealth, we're gonna come take it, fuck you, like, you know, and like they knew what kind of reaction that would have. So then I guess they were even doing it in the White House to Kennedy to make it sound like Castro's just this maniac and, you know, nobody likes him, and just to get him whatever they could to get him to sign off on the Bay of Pigs, and of course they never forgave him when he didn't fully sign off on it, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting, all the tricks that were being played around with.
This is an interesting part. I think this is from St. George. His quote's from Andrew St. George, which is what I was thinking of when he discusses techno-fascism. A lot of this is very prescient. Of course, it was pretty timely, like in the 70s as well. But it's especially like it, you can definitely see the resonances of this with what we're experiencing now. So St. George sees a monster he calls techno-fascism as emerging from the material conditions of ultra-modern production, from the computerization of everyday life. So he's not falling back on the Red Terror as being the legitimation of the police state. This is just something that's gonna realize itself through the nature of the ultramodern production. His position is sociologically sophisticated, Oglesby says. He borrows knowledgeably from the Weberian literature and incorporates the pessimism of current observers like Jacques Ellul and Hannah Arendt without a trace of unconfidence. St. George calls Watergate the poisonous afterbirth of Vietnam, an end to external conflict, the inward turning of the nation's aggressions, the unmistakable first step toward genuine convergence with our erstwhile totalitarian opponents. I knew that you're going to be upset about that. Okay, yeah. The United States intelligence is now turning inward in the citizens of this country. The next logical step would be for an administration to do exactly what its people suspected of doing: start mounting intelligence operations against citizen groups and assemblies. A little bit late in 1972 to right? Like, they just started saying, doing it. Go one day this might happen. Yeah, but
go talk to your fucking hero Ramsey Clark, who authorized Operation Chaos and COINTELPRO when he was Attorney General, but he's a hero in an Aaron Sorkin movie. Cool. Anyways, I can't with this liberal psycho history kind of thing of that feels very prescient to the type of writing people do in the Atlantic today of it's
one
a
day,
weird, like a weird psychoanalyzing of we were doing it, so we just had to come back and do it to ourselves because we're so sick. And I don't know, it's it's different from saying they brought the Phoenix program back home eventually. At least there's a kind of I don't know, a materiality to that or something, but it's what, I don't know.
Yeah, his analysis is very, because he says the era of foreign intervention is drawing to a close, and that's why this is happening. It's a similar thing to saying the frontier is disappearing. So now whereas these obviously
I think
we have
the thing with the frontier thing that is that Oglesby says it's a little bit more compelling is that involves real resources and stuff that have a real economic impact that trickles down in every other aspect of society. When you have kind of in their conception kind of a limitless land and just raw resources that you can just take, hey, there's a buffalo, let's just shoot it, and things like that. Those costs don't really get added into this into the accounting, so to speak. And so there's this feeling of oh, God's just providing us with all these free goodies. It's awesome. And then eventually when all the land gets taken up, that's not around anymore. And so you both have an economic problem, but it also could have a kind of psychological or existential manifestation of where's my free shit that I can use to profit off of all of a sudden. And if you get trained to basically have that helping you out the entire time, then when it's going through withdrawal or something, it's hey, where's my stimulus? And I think in some cases maybe the stimulus was kind of replaced by the federal government going in and dumping money into all these defense companies and things like that, and that might have helped. It's the methadone or whatever for these settler junkies.
Yeah.
But you constantly need to keep supplying a new fix of something. I can see that kind of being operative.
Yeah, and I do think that frontier in a mythopoetic kind of abstract way. There's always frontiers. You mentioned the internet and cyberspace. I think that the frontier of people's inner lives, is something that is.
I think that is a frontier that's being settled now in new scary ways.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think and Yeah, I feel like, you can definitely see on both hands, like, there's, a resonance between, like, the liberal grappling with, like, certain things that we're experiencing now, like the pandemic, like the Snowden stuff. This is kind of like a Snowden article almost. Like, Prism reveals that for the first time that, like, we have been spied on ever, like, or something like that. But
Oh my God. Well, that it also betrays the normie lib interpretation of Watergate that was like, oh, like, we never did a corrupt thing before, and then suddenly, like, what? Like, the president was, like, spying on his political rivals? What? Like, I've always been kind of annoyed ever since I learned a little more about Watergate, and I guess we can get into that in a second, that it was like, oh, just like, it's like somehow like the original sin of, like, American politics is like, oh, that one time that one president got a little bit out of hand and, spied on some people. But I think that Oglesby does a pretty good job of saying that, like, well, first of all, a lot of the same, like, organized crime and spooky right-wing CIA figures were, like, very heavily involved in both, like, the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy assassination, and Watergate. And, like, there's all these links between, and of course there's that whole Bay of Pigs thing, to quote Nixon, that was on one of the Watergate tapes, where he repeatedly references, like, we don't want that whole Bay of Pigs thing to get out. And it's not really clear why he's saying that, but he seems to be referencing something, because, the Bay of Pigs did get out. It was, everybody knows about it. So what does he mean Bay of Pigs thing? And a lot of people obviously postulate he's talking about
that's a
things he knows about
thing.
the Kennedy assassination. And not to say that, like, oh, like, Richard Nixon was the guy behind the grassy knoll with a rifle. That was George H.W. Bush, obviously, but it was. I think he knew more and was connected to figures who knew a lot more than, he was letting on. And, like, none of that ever came up. It's kind of like Trump and Russiagate a little bit, though. I mean, Nixon did get caught, like, doing stuff, and they actually got him. But it's a little bit like that, where there were probably, and yeah, we'll bring up Trump in this final segment in a minute.
That,
but
like, it's...
There has to be worse things that Trump was doing.
Trump did,
there
like,
have to be worse things he was doing that just, like, doing some bullshit with, like, a Russian diplomat.
It's similar to Nixon, but I feel like Trump had, like, Watergate level scandals, like, almost every week, but it was just a different
it just
climate.
Didn't matter anymore.
It just didn't matter because, like, the norms had changed. But in terms of the norms changing, I think that this is actually, like, an interesting, like, this is the sort of reading of St. George that I find to be interesting. He says, as St. George's example teaches, the computerization of everyday life will seem to embody an irresistibly transcendent force. But let us remember that we are actually looking back on the certain knowledge of a clandestine America, which these writers, speaking of Copeland and St. George, can still pretend to see as a future threat. We are trying to understand the onset of an achieved, not merely a prognosticated predicament, so we may not be so abstract. We must find the concrete mechanisms. The way into the blind snarls of clandestinism was led not by pious elders seeking to quiet the public sleep, or by robots programmed with a contempt for democracy. The way was taken step by step by ordinary human beings acting under the burden of ordinary human motives. And then he goes on to talk about the Round Table and such things. But
I mean, they might be doing sacrifices to demons also, but I think that definitely checks out.
There's also demons and jinn, but
certainly the idea of normal.
What I find to be compelling about that is, like, the idea of, like, the unstoppable march of, like, the teleology of the, like, technological progress and, like, the dissolution of, like, our the transformations that we've had to endure and our, like, predation by these organizations that, like, we're sort of taught to view as inevitable results of, like, some kind of like, robotic process. There's an interesting dialectic there, like, because in a way, like, yes, it is demonic and satanic, but part of the demonic and satanic power of it is, like, its illusion of unstoppable power, and of being, like, this
all-pervasive thing. I mean, is it a satanic
and always
psyop, to say that humans are a shit categorically? And then, I think it is. It's kind of satanic, to say that.
Yeah, well, to say humans are shit. Well, Yeah, what do you like? Humans are category. Well, compared
like
to what?
Yeah, or just human, like humans
compared to what?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's one thing to say that, like, a typical kind of nihilist thing of like people suck, or even kind of an Adam Curtis thing of like, people can't be trusted. Like you can't trust them, so you have to control them because we're all just bad little piggies, and we just like it's a kind of early 20th century like mass psychology kind of mentality.
I guess, but when you get into like these sort of moral ideas of like people being bad, then I need to understand like what that's based on. Like when people just say like, oh, it sucks because like bad things happen, like people are bad because like they harm each other or whatever, like people collectively are bad because like people harm each other. Well, then like why is harming each other bad? What is that based on? Again, like it gets into like a kind of axiology or like moral system, and like it has to have some kind of grounding.
Yes,
so like without that, like all this stuff is meaningless. But yeah, like another thing that like something else I think is like the constant postponement, the idea like one day like this will happen when like, we often find that like, the gate of the chicken factory is like slamming on us like what, before we even can recognize it. And that sense of like always like that eternal postponement. I feel like we're going to be talking about how the gate of the chicken factory is closing like long after it's already closed.
No, for sure. Yeah. Actually, Josh Harris, as the most recent I've heard, he says 2024 is when the door to the chicken factory is going to like fully close. So,
okay.
But I can see people saying it again and again and again, even when the door is closed.
Yeah.
Maybe the door's already closed. We don't know.
Yeah.
Hey, brother, ready for another dose of my Yankee pride? In the jungle, you just might stumble on something that you never tried. Got that right. There was trouble in the east, worry in the west, till the wall came tumbling down. Shift in the sand, rocket to the madman, haven't heard a sound. You don't have to worry, help is on the way. We don't need no thank you, man. We know what they're gonna say. They say, hey, hey, damn Yankee. Oh, damn Yankee. Now I say what I want, and I do what I want, and I go where I want to go. Ain't no strong man safe from the hangman, baby, now don't you know? If you need assistance, I'll be on the way. Run into a little resistance, you know what they're gonna say. They say, hey, hey, damn Yankee.
Our last segment here, I think we can talk about Watergate a little bit because I guess I take for granted that we've already discussed how the official story of like the president's men was basically like a fiction, much like Zero Dark 30 was later. I think it was like this Hollywood cooked up heroic narrative where the spooked out Washington Post just like got the story, and Office of Naval Intelligence Officer Bob Woodward just got deep throat to tell him all the blah blah blah. Anyways, that's all bullshit, and Oglesby calls it out. But maybe we'll just read like his intro to this section of the story. It gives probably the most succinct summary of his argument within the Yankee-Cowboy paradigm. So Oglesby writes that Watergate is a labyrinth we traverse in three directions in the following essays on Howard Hughes, Dorothy Hunt, and James McCord. My central claim is that the arrest of the Watergate burglars was the result of a setup, that it was no more an accident that the plumbers were caught than that they were in the offices of the Democratic National Committee to begin with, that there were actually two secret operations at Watergate, colliding invisibly as hunter and prey. The issues joined in this incredible intrigue are the general issues of the struggle between Yankees and Cowboys. The essay on Hughes takes up the Yankee-Cowboy theme at length and sets out to show in concrete detail how the larger forces thus indicated can be seen at work in the history of Hughes and his battles and wars, first against the East Coast banking combines around the Rockefellers, then against the International Crime Syndicate under Lansky. We follow step by step the evolution of the general features of the Watergate confrontation. The essay on Dorothy Hunt's death in an airplane crash argues that the crash was a result of sabotage with a Watergate-related motive. bearing on the crisis of the Howard Hunt White House blackmail scheme. I do not know or pretend to know how or by whom this plane was brought down, any more than I know who killed the two Kennedys and King. But just as in those cases, the careful review of the material evidence indicates that we are once again in the presence of an official deception in a capital case. The McCord essay then explores in detail the anomalies surrounding McCord's person and role in Watergate. The argument is that McCord did not blunder, that there was no slip-up to it when he left the telltale tape on the door, that he was actually an anti-Nixon double agent responsible to Yankee interests, point man in another Yankee attempt at counter-coup, this one a success. So, you know, pretty different from the story we were all taught. But given everything, now we both kind of skimmed through different parts of this section. I don't know what jumped out at you. I guess I guess maybe we could talk about Howard Hughes first, and just like I don't know if we could really do justice to Howard Hughes in today's episode. I think we might have to really like return back to him, and because there's so much weird shit that he was involved in, and he has such a kind of insane life biography. But I do think that I do think he provides an interesting context of Howard Hughes in this like Yankee-Cowboy thing. The way Oglesby describes it, Hughes unites in his single person all the major sides of cowboy capitalism's current situation: its compromised relationship to organized crime, its servility towards militaristic authority, its last-ditch entrepreneurial desperation and bitterness, its gradual transformation into multi-corporatized, i.e. monopolized business structures in spite of all. Yet Hughes was not the ally of big crime, and he was not, finally, Nixon's friend. So that's interesting. I don't know if you could really read into that, kind of like it sounds a little bit like Trump, or maybe some other kind of people, or I don't know, like who's that West Virginia like coal tycoon who ran for governor, and a lot of people died in his mines. Was his name like Blankenship or something? Kind of reminds me of that, like just the kind of like super corrupt, servile towards the military, engaged in last-ditch entrepreneurial desperation and bitterness, and like the gradual transformation into multi-corporatized business.
Are you talking about Don Blankenship?
I think I am. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, he did have a mine safety incident. Right. And he was,
and then he ran for governor after that, like on a Save Coal platform. You know,
he ran for Senate in West Virginia, and then he was the Constitution Party candidate in 2020.
There you go.
For president,
there you
that
go.
is.
I mean, Howard Hughes, he combines the weird worlds of like mobbed up casinos, like weird CIA expeditions, and like aerospace engineering, all kind of in one person.
Yeah, and like Hollywood as well.
Oh yeah, Hollywood too, of course. Yeah. It was a Hollywood studio head as well. So he really combines all of this. I've actually never seen The Aviator, the Scorsese movie about him.
Yeah, me neither. I actually haven't seen it either. I remember it coming out and like wanting to see it, but for some reason, like I never did. I don't know, but I
didn't know much at the time it came out about Howard Hughes, except that he was like this eccentric guy.
I'm sure it doesn't do justice to. I'm sure it's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like my impression of it was that it was sort of this like character study, like kind of like a Citizen Kane type thing. Like, he let his nails grow long, and he had like a movie theater in his house.
Had
like,
jars filled with his pee everywhere. Yeah, like just very creepy. He did kind of go insane near the end. And I also haven't seen the movie. It got really slammed as like terrible, but I think it was called Rules Don't Apply, and it was like a Warren Beatty passion project that he'd wanted to make for years, where he plays Howard Hughes. But apparently it was just like weird. Like, I don't know. It was all about him like seducing one of his like contract actresses or something, or like a love triangle developing with like a young actor like falls in love with his like co-star, but she's under contract to like she can't sleep with anybody except for Howard Hughes or something like. I think he had a rule like that in his studio. And wait, did he run RKO?
I don't know if it.
What was his studio?
Yes, it was RKO. Yeah.
So he even produced Citizen Kane then, basically.
Yeah. Wow. How about that? Yes.
And Scarface. And wow, the three of the movies mentioned on his Wikipedia are The Racket, Hell's Angels, and Scarface. It's very loaded right there. Obviously, before the Hells Angels, maybe that was like a coded shout out to
the straight Satans.
Very some lurid movies before the Hays Code was enacted.
But I'm certain the Aviator doesn't implicate Howard Hughes in you talk about the Aviator. He aviated Dorothy Hunt into oblivion. He aviated her to hell in a bucket.
Allegedly. Well, he did almost go to hell in a bucket
directly,
crashing
but
a few times.
Yeah, not directly, but kind of directly. He's very much like the motor of the whole thing. If he didn't personally carry it out.
And also instrumental in the development of Las Vegas as a sort of a casino gambling mecca. And basically, I think the mafia originally, I think it was Bugsy Siegel and maybe Mo Dalitz who kind of set up the mob casinos in Vegas, and then Hughes basically burst onto the scene and started buying up a lot of the hotels, including the Sands, Frontier, Silver Slipper, Castaways, and Landmark, and after a while became the largest employer in Nevada, in all of Nevada, and had a lot of really expensive experimental aircraft contracts with the Pentagon. Some of which he was criticized for not actually producing them, just getting paid for concept. It might have been the XF-11. Yeah, only 2 prototypes and a mock-up were completed, even though the Pentagon, or I guess not the Pentagon yet, but the Department, the U.S. Army Air Force ordered 100 of them in 1943. And then he built 2 and then crashed one and almost died. And then I guess that was the end of that. But very plugged in individual who, yes, eventually kind of went insane and made all kinds of other experimental aircraft. It also made the Glomar Explorer, which I think there was a whole thing around the Glomar Explorer where he wanted to do deep sea exploration, but they were actually trying to find a Soviet submarine that had sunk. And that was sort of a cover. He did contracting work with Henry Kaiser of future Kaiser Permanente fame, even though he was, I believe that's right. Yeah, he was, when I grew up in the Bay Area, there was the Kaiser shipyards in the kind of the North Bay near Vallejo. And they were called Liberty ships. And he just built a bunch of them really fast. And now they're all junked in a kind of neglected corner of the Bay Area. I think they might have gotten rid of them eventually, but in the 90s there were dozens of these rusty old World War II ships. And then, as you do, he had the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, and then decided, I think actually he had some kind of deal. I think he offered healthcare to his workers at the shipyards, and then was oh, I should turn this into a healthcare company or something, and basically then that, and then had I think Augustus Alexander Stanley's cousin and Tim Leary working for Kaiser Permanente in Oakland in the mid to late 1950s. The Kaiser Family Foundation, interestingly, moved from Oakland down to Menlo Park, which is right next to Palo Alto and Stanford. Big conglomerate now. So anyways, Howard Hughes was super wrapped up in with him during World War II. I don't know. Anyways, there's so much to go with the whole Watergate thing. What even to focus on? I know there's a few things that kind of relate tangentially to Trump that I wanted to mention.
Right. You wanted to mention the Resorts International thing, because that doesn't just relate to Trump, but it relates to Candy Jones.
Yep. We're really building out the lore of Paradise Island.
Yes, in the Candy Jones episode, we brought up the kind of Rockefeller Atlantis connection there. So there are some good tidbits on that.
There are, sure. And again, this is probably one of the earliest mentions in any kind of conspiracy writing or whatever that kind of focuses on Resorts International and just how sus it is. It does mention here there's a company that I think was subsumed by it. There was an individual named James Golden, and Howard Hughes met James Golden in the Bahamas, and James Golden was working for a company called Intertel, which was like a private intelligence network, a private intelligence company that was contracted by usually corporations, but also by various probably intelligence figures and maybe organized crime and things like that. But this guy, James Golden, he was a Secret Service guy for he was a former Secret Service man, and he was known around, his reputation was as, quote, Nixon's man, and he was assigned to Vice President Nixon in 1957. He accompanied him to the Soviet Union and Central America. They apparently got stoned together in Venezuela. I don't know what the source of that quote is, but they became very close. And when Nixon left the White House in 1960, Golden left the Secret Service to take a job as security chief for Lockheed. And in 1968, Lockheed gave him a leave of absence to join Nixon's campaign as director of security. And after Nixon's election, Golden became Resorts International's deputy director of security on Paradise Island and was a founding officer of Intertel and one of its vice presidents at the time. At the time of the events of November. I'm not sure what that's referring to. He later joined the Hughes Las Vegas staff, and as of summer 1975, he was at the Justice Department as chief of the Organized Crime Strike Force of the Law Enforcement Assistance Agency. So that was he was referring to Thanksgiving 1970 when Robert Mayhew, who was Howard Hughes's right-hand man and fixer, was kicked out of Las Vegas or something like that. There was all kinds of stuff going on there, but there's a couple. Let me see if there's any other references to Resorts International. Which, for anybody that doesn't know, the reason we're talking about it is because Donald Trump purchased the majority share in Resorts International in 1987 and got into like a corporate ownership battle with Merv Griffin over it, and basically. Yeah, so it also showed up in one of Mark Lombardi's unfinished interlocks that he was working on before he died, and was pretty much understood to be it really does line up with like all the cast of characters that Oglesby is talking about. Like basically a joint venture between Alan Dulles and the Meyer-Lansky Syndicate that I think was maybe started in the 1950s and had this casino on Paradise Island where also Candy Jones, who I certainly believe was hypno-programmed by the CIA in like an experimental capacity, where her handler instructed her to go and programmed her to jump off of a cliff and commit suicide, which was she was supposed to go down to Resorts International.
She didn't actually do so, for those who maybe haven't heard that episode, although you should definitely listen to it. She did not do it. I wonder if James Golden was like the security chief at the time that she did that, and it's like, oh, our man is in charge. We postulated like where's a better place for like a CIA hypno-programmed asset to like commit suicide in a very sus way. Like, oh yeah, go to the CIA Mafia Casino Island. That was also, oh yeah, by the way, it gets crazy. I think it used to be called Hog Island. There's a few sus owners of it, including a Swedish Nazi industrialist named Axel Wenner-Gren, who went on to build the Disneyland monorail and also found the Mexican telecom company in Mexico in like the 1950s, and was a very close friend of Hermann Goering and also the abdicated king. Was it King Edward? Or who was the one who was a Nazi and then gave up the throne in the 1930s? Because he was made governor of the Bahamas during the war. Was King Edward didn't abdicate because he was a Nazi, did he?
It wasn't. Well, and I'm sorry. He didn't abdicate. He didn't abdicate because he was a Nazi. He abdicated because he married an American girl.
Wallace Simpson. Yeah.
Yeah. Nothing new under the sun. You get kicked out of the royal family if you marry an American.
But was he also a Nazi?
Yes, he was.
Oh yeah. Well, they did go to tour Nazi Germany. Yes, right.
No, he was an admirer of Hitler. Yeah. He was actually. I mean, maybe not like. But there was that picture in the British tabloids a few years ago of him getting like a 4-year-old Queen Elizabeth at the time to like do a Nazi salute, and he's like standing behind her like, here's how you do it, and like smiling at the camera. This guy, he was very sus. But apparently him and Axel Wenner-Gren were just like great buddies in the Bahamas like during the war, and I think Axel Wenner-Gren was suspected of being like a Nazi spy, but then of course after the war like he becomes best friends with Walt Disney and builds the Alweg, I think was his company, and they built the super-based futuristic monorail. So, you know, you can see the connections just like spiral in like every direction.
Run on time, you know.
Exactly. And so, Paradise Island in the Bahamas, super sus. It's, I think Saul Kersner now owns it, and Donald Trump, he didn't own it for that long, but we've always wondered, like, what was he up to buying Resorts International? It seemed kind of a random. He was kind of getting into like the casino game, you know, during that decade, but I don't know, the level of his interest is considering that he was probably doing like money laundering for like he used to brag about rubbing elbows with like organized crime people in New York all the time, and he's in the construction business, so really kind of makes you want, as his celebrity was rising and, you know, he was becoming this like Mr. Lifestyles of the rich and famous and all that kind of stuff. I know Adnan Khashoggi, I think, had an island in the vicinity of that where he had some deal with like he could fly drug planes onto it, and like the customs people would come by the next day. Like he just had, you know, like, oh, okay, it's clean. But yeah, so Resorts International ended up owning 94% of Intertel, this private intelligence thing. So Oglesby says, like, even if Intertel was not the CIA of the Lansky Syndicate, it was still at least the CIA of Resorts International. And Resorts International, whether it was a syndicate front or not, was still Hughes' chief competition. So there's even a kind of, like once again, a dialectical rivalry going on between perhaps this mobbed up Lansky casino and whatever Hughes was trying to do, but there's other stuff as well. There's a lot. Robert Mayhew would be another interesting person to kind of spin off and do a whole thing.
Yeah, he's all over this for sure.
The grandfather of our favorite podcasters, Robert Mullen and company, get a good mention here as being a very sus outfit that was connected to ITT and Creep and all these other things. Oh, even Douglas Caddy worked out of Mullen offices during the halcyon days of the Huston Plan. Douglas Caddy is an interesting guy, actually. We should try to get him. He's like still alive. I've heard him go on Ed Opperman's radio show. He has some wild stories about the Watergate era. He has a story, I shit you not, like where Henry Kissinger like sent him to be the courier to bring some kind of like he had to like tape like a audio reel to like his chest or something, and like secretly transported to somebody else that apparently had evidence about like aliens on it. So it's like very it's like he's got it, like, but he was a real figure that was like really involved in this world and was a Watergate lawyer. But then he has this story about like making some kind of treaty with like ETs, and like Nick and Kissinger was using him as a go-between to communicate some kind of, so he's got an even like a deeper level of, I guess, Watergate intrigue going on there. I don't know, he might just be psyoping, I have no idea, but it's pretty far out. So
yes, it certainly is. Merritt reveals that he met 3 times with President Nixon in a deep underground location beneath the White House. Nixon read him a letter saying the U.S. was protecting an extraterrestrial being and that scientists at Los Alamos were able to communicate with it and obtain advanced technology and science. Oh, he put the letter in a time capsule that he hid somewhere in the White House. Wow. While the time capsule is still in there.
Yeah, also he also claims...
He pulled it out. And on the front was written to Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, right? See? Okay, I did remember.
Subjects from the planet X.
Also, this is an ultimate thing. I just see this right here. He says in his autobiography, Being There, Eyewitness to History, Caddy claims that when he asked Howard Hunt why President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, E. Howard Hunt told him it was because Kennedy was about to disclose the alien presence to the Soviet Union. No. Okay. Yeah. So I guess Kennedy was going to do the ultimate like betrayal and tell those awful commies about the alien presence, and
he would have given away the ultimate strategic advantage. Maybe he was going to tell them about the Yeti, but or the Sasquatch.
There are a number of weird like things around both these events that remember. I don't know if we ever brought it up before, but Timothy Leary had a very bizarre I think it was, I don't know if it came directly from him, but I feel like maybe it had to do with Claire Booth Luce, who was a Washington D.C. socialite, who was, I think, murdered while jogging, I want to say, no, maybe not, but let me just double check. No, she had brain cancer, never mind. This is Henry Luce's wife, I think. I want to say it was her that said that like Timothy Leary somehow got like JFK to start dropping I don't know, somebody who JFK was having an affair with.
There is some weird LSD stuff around Watergate. Oh, sorry, finish your story first. But I feel like there's a bunch of like weird,
I'm trying to remember exactly who, because I don't think it was Mary Pinchot Meyer. I get these three named Washington D.C. like CIA people. Cord Meyer's wife. So she, I think, claimed, and maybe Timothy Leary was okay. Yeah, here we go. Spartacus Educational actually has this thing right here. You know, Timothy Leary, best friends of G. Gordon Liddy, who is no longer with us as of this week. Yeah, just good buddies. Okay, here it is. According to Timothy Leary's biography, Flashbacks, he claims Mary Pinchot Meyer phoned him on the day after John F. Kennedy was assassinated and said they couldn't control him anymore. He was changing too fast. He was learning too much. They'll cover everything up. I gotta come see you. I'm scared. I'm afraid. And I guess like what she was referring to is like they had been doing LSD together, and Kennedy was like, whoa, like, wait a minute, man. Like, I'm a hippie now, and wanted to like end the war. And it's like, I don't know, somehow like they tried to MK him, but like it did the opposite thing, and he just wanted to like declare world peace. And so they just had to kill him. Like he was getting too enlightened. So like really got to consider the source with that one, that if only, you know, JFK like kept tripping and didn't get murdered for it, then we would have just had like world peace. Not quite convinced. But speaking of wives of these people getting involved in situations, do you want to talk a little bit just about the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt real quick?
But one thing related to LSD that I felt I should mention that I discovered kind of ancillary to this is that I guess Jack Anderson, he had covered like Nixon unfavorably. Oh yeah, actually he was the one who had uncovered the idea of a secret loan from Howard Hughes to Nixon's brother, you know, back in 1960. And so Nixon already didn't like him. And then in 1972, apparently there was like a discussion of assassinating this guy. And one of their techniques that they discussed, Liddy and Hunt, they discussed like covering his steering wheel with LSD so that it would like seep into his skin and make him crash. These people obviously were interested in the idea of arranging vehicle crashes. That's basically what Oglesby alleges about the crash of, it was 553.
Ted Kennedy?
No, not Ted Kennedy. I mean, although maybe. 53? I mean, they probably did also try to assassinate Ted Kennedy. But Dorothy Hunt's plane, United Airlines Flight 553. Yeah, which it was the first like 737 to crash, you know, so it was a big, you know, there's a lot of suspicious stuff around the plane. There's, you know, it's not, I kind of like gave the wrong impression before. It's not really like that Howard Hughes like did it. Like, I mean, I guess it is possible because it's all very murky and it involves planes, which would seem to be the thing that like, you know, a deranged industrialist obsessed with planes might contrive to do. But the main suspect is like the CIA, that the CIA caused the crash. And it was, in fact, Charles Colson himself who, you know, who was Nixon's special counsel, I think, during Watergate, who implicated the CIA originally.
One of our, I do see that right away, one of our favorite old school conspiracy researchers, Sherman Skolnick, alleged that the CIA had basically sabotaged it. I think at the time. He was really on the hunt of a lot of like Chicago corruption and all that stuff. So, wow. So Chuck Colson even said that it was the CIA.
Yes, there's actually a interesting article in, I guess it was originally published in The Nation. There's like a mirror of it, like a janky mirror on time.com that I'm reading. It's called The Nation, Colson's Weird Scenario. So maybe this is about The Nation, and it's from Time. But anyway, the CIA was involved in all aspects of Watergate, said Colson as he ticked them off. The agency helped carry out the burglary of the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, destroyed evidence, put out a cover story to camouflage its part in the Watergate break-in, and tried to divert the FBI from investigating it. He confessed to Bass to that, that rivalry between the CIA and the FBI, and their friction between each other that would factor into another famous plane incident. He confessed to Bass, don't say this to my people. They think I'm nuts. I think they killed Dorothy Hunt. He was referring to the death of E. Howard Hunt's wife in an air crash in 1972. Colson thought that the agency was trying to silence her. Almost gratuitously, Colson told Bass that he believed Howard Hughes had given $100,000 and even more to the president and his family for their private use. Hughes can blow the whistle on him. When parts of Colson's yarn were published last week, I guess this article was published in 1974, no one was more interested than Senator Howard Baker, vice chairman of the Watergate Committee. Suspecting a CIA link to Watergate, Baker had written a 35-page unpublished report in the subject with some help from Colson. But Baker aides claim there is nothing in the report to substantiate Colson's charge that the agency had a role in planning or executing the Watergate break-in, much less plotting against the president. There are, of course, some unanswered questions about the CIA's relationship to Watergate. Some men deeply involved in Watergate, notably E. Howard Hunt Jr. and James McCord, were retired longtime employees of the agency. A CIA agent was on hand when McCord's wife burned some of his personal papers. Colson's monstrous plot, however, can scarcely be constructed from such shards. Why then did he unburden himself to Bass? One theory is that Colson wanted to make a last desperate try to get himself and the president off the hook. So why not blame Watergate and the CIA, which is already highly suspect to much of the public and in no position to defend itself? If this was indeed the scheme, then considering how battered American institutions are and how in need of support and not defamation, it was one of the dirtiest tricks that Colson has played to date. But another explanation is that Colson has lost touch with reality. When he was talking to Bass, he appeared calm at times quite agitated. At one point, he remarked to the detective, "You might think I belong in an asylum." A Colson associate thinks that impending imprisonment may have weighed on him. Look, you're going to jail. You get pretty desperate. In a sense, Colson's CIA fantasies are not that far removed from some of his previous schemes. Firebombing the Brookings Institution.
What?
Was critical support, for instance, or forging cables linking President Kennedy to the assassination of South Vietnam's President Diem. The key question
that's
is
a big
not
thing
why
everyone
Colson,
likes to do.
Yeah. Yes, he forged cables.
I think even E. Howard Hunt did that. He said that, oh, yeah, totally trust me. Kennedy totally did that.
I think that, he, it was Colson's original plan. I think he directed them to do it. And they were, tasked with coming up with how. Probably the same thing with, putting the LSD on the steering wheel. The key question is not why Colson is the way he is, but why he was ever given easy access to the highest office in the land. So, pretty article about the whole situation. He's gone, obviously he's gone crazy, or, he's trying to get himself off the hook.
Yeah.
Without crediting anything that he was suggesting. But
I just wanted to point out, because actually Oglesby does dedicate a little time talking about Sherman Skolnick's claims in that chapter, and kind of shares some stuff that I actually didn't know about Sherman Skolnick that I'm going to keep in mind for the future, because he wrote about men. I think his blog, I hope it's still alive. He has some really good, interesting stuff, but I guess Oglesby said that the criticism of the official pilot error theory of the Hunt crash has been overwhelmingly identified with Sherman Skolnick, a Chicago-based private investigator, and his colleague, companion, and bodyguard, Alex Batos, who has a murky background and claims former FBI, CIA, and narcotics connections. Skolnick and Batos are a pungent Dickensian pair. Skolnick has been confined from birth to a wheelchair. He's intense, loud, overbearing, quick, suspicious, sometimes merry, all upper torso and arms, boisterous, gnomic-faced. Sounds like Alex Jones a little bit. Bados is more somber and sepulchral.
Gnomic-faced. Okay.
Yeah, he says he was at Opelika in 1960-61 with E. Howard Hunt on the Bay of Pigs campaign. He carries a pistol and is fond of flashing it. He dresses with old-fashioned nattiness and polishes to a high gloss both his black hair and his black patent leather loafers. Skolnick and Bados have seen each other through great controversies. They project an ominous, swirling, shadowy atmosphere, Skolnick wheeling and challenging, Bados in a tailored flak jacket brooding on collapse. The instrument of their collaboration is Skolnick's Citizens Committee to Clean Up the Courts. Their most spectacular hit so far, until United Flight 553, was Chicago's once immaculate liberal, Governor Otto Kerner, whom they discovered and exposed in a racetrack payoff scheme. Skolnick and Bados have also helped put away several Illinois Supreme Court judges on corruption counts. Skolnick was instantaneous in charging that the crash of United Flight 553 was the result of sabotage and that there was a big Watergate connection. In the weeks immediately following the crash, he claims to have received a flood of information from protected inside sources supporting him in this belief. He also tried to make that information public, thus to generate a controversy and a demand for a new investigation of the crash. Oh, this is kind of interesting. In the furor of claim and counterclaim that followed, Skolnick's voice often reached an intensity that many found hysterical. Anyone who disagreed with him about anything, your author much included, he denounced as a secret agent of the CIA. The controversy over his personality came to interfuse with the controversy over the crash. He made it easy for his detractors to ridicule him for rampant paranoia and to ignore his specific claims as wild raving. Yet in the instances in which the dispute has been resolved by a subsequent factual disclosure, Skolnick's contentions have been substantially borne out. The question of FBI involvement in the crash investigation is the perfect case in point. So, yeah, I think it is interesting. This is an interesting. Reminds me of Gary Caradori's plane spontaneously crashing. The Boeing 737 had barely hit, said Skolnick. Before the crash site was a swarm with large numbers. He sometimes said carloads, sometimes 200, sometimes dozens, of, quote, federal people who shouldered Chicago police and firemen aside and kept to themselves why and on what authority they were doing so. When I first encountered the array of Skolnick's arguments about the crash, I dismissed this particular item, the 200 FBI agents prowling the wreckage within moments of the crash, as an improbable piece of melodramatic adornment. In my original summary of Skolnick's case in the Boston Phoenix, I left the point out altogether, concentrating on what I regarded as his more impressive arguments. But then came the disclosure, as a result of Skolnick's agitation in Washington, of the two letters which I reprint in their entirety below. The first is from the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, John Reed, to acting FBI Director William Ruckelshaus. The second is Ruckelshaus's reply. The NTSB is a putatively independent branch of the Department of Transportation with responsibility for investigating all accidents, much like Gary Caradori's, where they're like, oh, nothing to see here. So I guess, I don't know. I guess, let me see. Does it bear it out? They wrote to the FBI director that our investigative team assigned to this incident discovered on the day following the incident that several FBI agents had taken a number of non-typical actions relating to this accident within the first few hours following the accident. Included were, for the first time in the memory of our staff, an FBI agent went to the control tower and listened to the tower tapes before our investigators had done so. And for the first time to our knowledge, in connection with an aircraft accident, an FBI agent interviewed witnesses to the crash, including flight attendants on the aircraft, prior to the NTSB interviews. As I'm sure you can understand, these actions, particularly with respect to this flight on which Mrs. E. Howard Hunt was killed, have raised innumerable questions in the mind of those with legitimate interest in ascertaining the cause of this accident. Included among those who have asked is the bunch of government committees, and they say, on the basis of informal discussions, it is likely the questions as to what specific actions were taken by the FBI in conjunction with the aircraft accident and why such actions were taken will come up in a public oversight hearing. Okay, so they were just asking for like more information. And okay, here's the thing. Director William Ruckelshaus says, approximately 50 FBI agents responded to the crash scene, the first ones arriving within 45 minutes of the crash. He also claims that basically the FBI had the fact that Mrs. E. Howard Hunt was on board the plane was unknown to the FBI at the time our investigation was started.
So then
but
how did they,
50 FBI agents like sped over there immediately and interviewed the witnesses, including the flight attendants.
Something Oglesby brings up is that like the FBI was tailing her, but like they didn't like follow her onto the plane. Which I feel like, you wouldn't necessarily need to follow someone onto a plane if you were tailing them, but like the idea that they didn't know she was on the plane and the fact that they like swarmed there quickly, that's one of the big things that he points out. There's also the cyanide thing.
What was the cyanide thing?
Which the cyanide thing is basically, it kind of like falls apart a little bit, but there's something there. James Walsh, administrative assistant to the Cook County coroner, told James Brady of New York Magazine, "We found 7 bodies which contained enough cyanide to kill them. We are not saying cyanide killed them, but that there was enough of it to have done so." Brady notes that Walsh refused to say whether or not the pilot's body contained cyanide. But Skolnick had already unearthed FAA Technical Exhibit number 6A, docket number SA 435, entitled Human Factors Group Chairman's Factual Report by C. Hayden Leroy. Page 8 of this exhibit contains in its entirety a typewritten table introduced by the words Federal Aviation Administration, Civil Aeromedical Institute, Aviation Toxicology Laboratory, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, examined specimens from 3 aircraft occupants. Results were as followed. Among other things, the table shows that the 3 whose bodies were examined by the Civil Aeromedical Institute were Captain Whitehouse, Flight Officer W.O. Coble, and a first-class passenger otherwise unidentified. According to NTSB, of course we can put it together. By the item, cyanide, the value entered for Captain Whitehouse is 3.9 milligrams per millimeter. In the columns for Coble and the first-class passenger, there are hyphens indicating the test for cyanide was not carried out on them. What does it mean that Whitehouse had 3.9 milligrams per millimeter of cyanide in him? For the record, let us first note that NTSB had some trouble establishing this figure. The Chicago Coroner's Office reported to begin with that Whitehouse's blood showed cyanide in the amount of 2.11 milligrams per milliliter, an extremely high amount which by itself would establish a prima facie case of foul play. So Ronald Dorfman, a defender of the no-sabotage theory, an editor of the Chicago Journalism Review, which Skolnick, true to character, denounces the CIA front, wrote that he checked this figure with Paul W. Smith, chief of the Aviation Toxicology Laboratory of the Civil Aeromedical Institute, and that Dr. Smith told him, "We are very unhappy and frankly don't know how they did their measurements." He is talking about the Chicago coroners, a handful of whom were fired for incompetence on account of this controversy. Smith continued, "They picked up cyanide in 10 or 12 victims and they were all very high. Then they realized they probably made an error which they interpreted to be a decimal error, and they altered their report. In moving the decimal, their figures became innocuous, all less than 1 microgram."
How do you get trace amounts of cyanide in your system? Even if they say,
I don't know. I feel like you can. There is cyanide and other stuff, right?
That also reminds me of an anecdote that was given to R. Fletcher Prouty provided to Oglesby earlier on when he was talking about the Bay of Pigs. That I feel like just because of the numbers involved is worth and also moving decibel points. Where basically he claimed that here it is. Prouty supports Haynes Johnson's view that Eisenhower did not support the decision to invade Cuba. He writes, "In fact, all of the Eisenhower schemes were extremely modest when it came to action against Cuban soil and property. In an interview I had with Prouty in Washington in May 1973, he added an interesting detail. What Eisenhower had approved in the way of an anti-Castro action program," said Prouty, "was a 33-man project looking toward the feasibility of forming a guerrilla base in the countryside. But within days of the election of Kennedy," says Prouty, quote, "orders came down," he does not say from where, "to change the 33s on the program's personnel records into 3300s. So I guess they they took the approval for 33 and then just etched in two more zeros so that they could recruit 3,300 Cuban Gusanos to invade with an entire armed force as opposed to just some random guerrillas. But still 33. What's that all about with everybody planning the Bay of Pigs? We need some multiple of 33 to go. That feels like some weird and then if you think about King Kill 33, which I know we didn't get to talk about, but that's all about the numbers right there, and of course also
this is reminding me of Chief David Henry and David X Henry, and we have officers in 33 states or whatever. It's also I'm also thinking about Tex Joe 330.
Yes. Also, I think that also when you look at how things played out down the road, I'm just double checking it right now, but I believe that the head of the Warren Commission, Justice Earl Warren, was a 33rd degree Mason as well. Yes, he was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason and was the Grand Master of California for 1 year. And and he was, a Californian, basically. Oh, the J. Edgar Hoover, by the way, 33rd degree Inspector General Honorary in 1955, and was given the Grand Cross of Honor, the highest recognition by the Scottish Rite, in 1965. So we're just swimming in Masons. Even Simone Bolivar. I did not know that, but that's a little bit upsetting. I don't know what that means. Simone Bolivar was a 33rd degree Mason as well.
Before we leave the cyanide thing behind, this is, just a final note on this. Oglesby says, Dr. Smith proceeded to analyze a blood specimen from the pilot, but not the others, to see how much cyanide actually was present, and the value he came up with was not an innocuous 0.211 micrograms per milliliter, which is the value arrived at by assuming that there was an error in the placing of the decimal point. Rather, it is the 3.9 micrograms per milliliter value we found in Exhibit 6A. That value in the first place does not bear out the Chicago coroner's guess that their assumed error was in the decimal. There is still a difference of a whole magnitude between their adjusted value of 0.2 micrograms per milliliter and Dr. Smith's new value of 3.9 micrograms per milliliter. It's not an innocuous level. A fact which even Dorfman concedes indirectly when he notes that this is the highest blood cyanide reading Dr. Smith has ever recorded in a crash victim. Dorfman continues, a recent toxicologist I consulted confirmed that while a concentration of 3.9 micrograms is more than enough to kill, it is quite possible, depending on a concentration of cyanide gas in the air and the physical condition of the victim, to inhale that much before death occurs. So you literally couldn't ingest that much cyanide without dying first. No, you couldn't. You definitely is enough to kill, but the idea is that, and Oglesby, points out that, the way the goalposts are kind of shifting. He says, a moment before we were being told that the pilot died a normal cyanide death, period. Now we are being told that it is not absurd on the facts to speculate that he did. Okay, now, this is giving me a lot of, flashbacks to, Kurt Cobain's kind of bizarre murder where he, shot himself up with, 3 grams of heroin and then somehow managed to, pick up a shotgun and shoot himself when that level of heroin would immediately incapacitate you and then kill you. So it's oh really? He just he took off the little, he put his little heroin kit away and you put it away all tidy. And then grabbed a shotgun and then stretched out really far because he was tiny. And then it's just what? He walked all the way to the greenhouse, just very bizarre. They really wanted some people dead if they were, I don't know how you would get cyanide. I don't know, did they have some hypno programmed to kill person on the plane that was gonna slip cyanide into their drinks and then go down with them? I have no idea. I don't know. Or did they just put cyanide in everybody, all the drinks, so that everybody was gonna die? Well, I guess they only found it in 12 people? Yeah, that's what they say, 12 people. Yeah, that is strange. It's very strange. I guess Skolnick really went in on the cyanide angle and made a lot of things and then got attacked. There's a writer named Dorfman who earned back against this kind of thing and said that it was all debunked, et cetera, et cetera. Oh yeah, Dorothy Hunt was in the first class cabin, so I wonder if she was the one person in first class that had it. But maybe we can start to wrap up. But I did find a good quote here. He's talking about Skolnick, but I think it encapsulates a lot about the ontology of this book and even the ontology of this podcast. And how we approach these critical paranoid issues. Oglesby, after talking about Dorfman attacking Skolnick for being a crazy conspiracy theorist, he says, still, Skolnick's informed misses teach us more of the truth of Watergate power politics than the baseless reassurances Dorfman prefers. That is because, first, Skolnick's overall conception of what goes into politics, what constitutes it, what comes out, is currently rooted in real experience. So even wandering it is most hysterical through a dismal swamp, as perhaps with the cyanide question and perhaps not, Skolnick still makes more sense and does more good teaching than those who use modest rhetoric to tell us there is nothing wrong.
Something, in fact, may be quite wrong. The wrong may be of satanic magnitude, and there is no way the standard statistic-ridden political sociology models employed in conventional federal academic discourse can even focus the structured character of what is wrong. These models, these assumptions, give us a lone madman here and a lone madman there, as though our time's violent assault on presidential figures were the purest contingency, purest acts of God, unstructured, random events lying outside of the events constitutive of politics proper, and of no greater interest to the political scientist than the normal airplane accident or the normal heart attack.
That's literally like
BTFO Chomsky. Literally random events, no greater interest to the serious scientists at all. So I think he's right that like that people can't even when Skolnick is like freaking out and making like kind of poorly sourced like speculative allegations, he has a better ontology of what this world really is. And so it can be more valuable to listen to somebody like that than to like the experts who believe in the traditional ontologies of science is real, water is life, and no conspiracy over 50 people can ever exist. You know?
Yeah.
You're never going to get close to it.
Yeah, ontologically impossible for there to be a conspiracy of over 50 people, as we know. Yeah, and interesting about Carl Oglesby that, I thought it would be interesting to mention is that he was, like, in SDS. I don't know if he mentioned that, but, yeah, he was, like, in SDS, but he kind of got, like, phased out of SDS for being, like, a little bit too bourgeois in his mentality and not, reading Settlers. No, but I mean, I don't know. It seemed like it seems like he almost did read Settlers, or, like, the equivalent. But I guess he was kind of like the Sean P. McCartney of his time. Sorry, that was...
Well, I mean, I guess he was and he wasn't.
Yeah, because he was all about, like, alliances. He loved, like, Murray Rothbard.
Interesting.
And
he wanted to do
like
kind of... Oh, I see. He wanted to, like, align with some, like, paleo conservatives or something to kind of interesting. Yeah, I mean, his politics are kind of slippery. Also, I forget if we mentioned at the very beginning, did we mention it, or were we talking about it before we recorded, about how he has such a similar background to people like Pynchon and Kurt Vonnegut and Chomsky himself, in that he started out working in the technical writing division at Bendix Systems. Oh, yeah, right. Contractor.
Yeah, he was right. Yes.
Until 1965. Yeah, exactly. And so he worked for he worked for a defense contractor. He actually headed the technical writing division. That's like very Pynchon-esque, and was kind of like, this is in the late 50s, and he really wasn't he was just like a middle class corporate man. Like, he didn't really think too much about politics, and also, like, he knew apparently that Bendix was designing systems to distribute chemicals and poisons over the Vietnamese jungle, but he was, quote, not above his work at Bendix, and didn't really think he was working as a writer for the Wes Vivian congressional campaign in '64, was asked to produce a position paper on Vietnam in case the issue came up, and I guess that gave him like a crash course in Vietnamese history, and I guess that's how he found his way to the SDS, and then kind of got but this is an interesting thing that I guess informed this book. It said his first ideological struggle, this is on the UMass website, by the way, that holds his papers, UMass Amherst, said his first real ideological struggle with his middle-class lifestyle and career came the previous year when President Kennedy was assassinated. Despite the fact that he and his colleagues faced a looming deadline, Oglesby was concerned that the flag had not been lowered as a sign of respect to the fallen president. When he tried to urge management at Bendix to lower the flag to half-mast, he encountered a strange scene in which the executives seemed to actually be celebrating Kennedy's death. And that like started him off, I guess, on this feeling of yikes, these people are psychos and they love that Kennedy's dead, which I think makes a lot of sense. But then he was in SDS, and he was close to Bernadine Dorn, who I think broke off, and I think wasn't Bernadine Dorn the one? Well, I think she was like
Dorn is like Aaron Sorkin's go-to name for like a crazy leftist.
But like I think she's in the what is it? The Trial of the Chicago 7, I believe. But like she's been completely reformed into like a cool kind of hippie, badass, like rad lib kind of character who's just like a sidekick, of course, you know, of like all the badass male hero. I mean, everybody's kind of turned into like a super just like West Wingy liberal,
like a fictionalized thing, like oh, I see. Okay,
it's like, you know, with Sacha Baron Cohen and all those people. She's like you know, kind of plays like the secretary like in Chicago. But you know, the thing is, like, well, one, I think I'm pretty sure she gave the very infamous quote in 1969 when SDS was kind of like splintering and all this crazy shit was happening right after the Manson murders, where she said like groovy, like that was like, did you see what those righteous dudes like did to those pig rich people? Like good, like awesome. Yeah, well, let me see if I could find. It's like too good. The Weathermen dig Charles Manson, declared Benedict Dorset. Dig it. First they killed those pigs, then they ate dinner in the same room with them. They even shoved a fork into a victim's stomach. Wild. She claims now that this was an ironic joke. She was saying like LOL, critical support for the Manson family. But I guess her split with Oglesby.
I could see contemporary leftists doing that and being like, yeah, we love Charles Manson. I mean, they killed those pigs, right? Like,
dig it.
We're so violent and everything. So like, why wouldn't we support him? Right?
Yes.
That's
and
what
in fact,
think,
you know, this was
you know,
this was that was the same year that she broke off with Bill Ayers, Obama's spiritual mentor, and you know, basically formed the Weather Underground. And that was, I guess, Oglesby was unhappy in 1969 when she, along with other key members of the SDS, decided that their principle of engaging only in nonviolent protests was no longer an effective way to achieve their goals. So they needed to have LSD orgies and blow up like random buildings. So they began to bomb post offices and other government properties, and they killed 3 of their own members in building a bomb in a Greenwich Village safe house in 1971. So, yeah, you know, it seems pretty that's real adventurism hours up in here. Mm-hmm. And I guess, you know, Oglesby just thought like, okay, the SDS is like dead now. They're stupid. But then he started in 1972 the Assassination Information Bureau, which started looking into JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King's murders. And that's eventually what led to this book. I'm not sure really what he did after that, but I guess he did. In 1988, he formed the Institute for Continuing Denazification, which was all about organizing efforts to bring full public disclosure to the top secret government documents containing information about the relationship between the Gehlen organization and the U.S. government. He filed multiple lawsuits, and I guess his lawsuit has been moving through the federal court system for over 2 decades, but it has resulted in the release of thousands of pages of classified top secret government documents, which form the backbone of his research on the Gehlen org. And but I guess he might still be alive, actually. Oh no, he died of lung cancer in 2011.
Yes.
Bummer. He never got to write that book about the Gehlen org, I guess, that he was chasing. Yeah. But you know what? I think, you know, even though not a Marxist, not a tanky, not a Muslim either. So, but I think we can say that
he doesn't mention Islam at all in this whole book.
But he was raised religious. I don't know. He was accused of being an atheist, but he wasn't. I guess an atheist ultimately. But I think there's this
time when you could be accused of being atheist.
Like, you know, right, and not just like celebrated for it.
Yeah, not celebrated for gyrating on Satan's lap. You're more likely to be accused of not like loving it when someone sexually like profanes themselves before like the Dark Prince. Like, you're not clapping hard enough. Excuse me, are you okay? Do you need me to call HR?
Seek help. Seek help.
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
Not loving this. Seek help. Yeah.
Exactly. Hello, police. He wasn't clapping.
I think there's a space for Oglesby on the Subliminal Jihad bookshelf, on the good bookshelf, not the bad one.
Yeah.
I think he did some good work here. I think his ontology, his dialectical ontology, I think is pretty. You know, while I don't know if we can directly apply it today, it helps me understand these things like a little bit better, because if Donald Trump is connected to literally like the cowboy mafia thing that was going on, you know, down in the Bahamas, maybe elsewhere, there could be certain continuities there. But I do feel like between the 80s and the 90s, there's like a blacked out period where it's not exactly clear still what precisely kind of happened with like the mafia deep state relationship, because suddenly they're kind of going after all these Cosa Nostra people in the 80s, people like James Comey and Bob Mueller and Rudy Giuliani. All these like sus prosecutors made their careers off of getting tough on the mob, but that was after 40 years of just like denying that they existed and totally like collaborating with them. So it's like, what happened, right? You know, we've talked about that before. Did they not? Did they find a better deal elsewhere? Did they become expendable? Hard to say, but definitely the alliance of like crime and like the different ruling classes. I think very great point that he made, that the triumph over communism could only be accomplished by allying with the criminal underworld, because they were the only people that were capable on like a almost like a street fighting level.
I feel like that's a common like fantasy, you know, like of like, because they have a sense of honor, you know, like it's like this weird thing. Like I feel like that has a cultural ripple as well, where it's like just this like reverence for like organized crime figures that like, yeah, they would team up with us patriots like if it push came to shove or whatever, you know, like
well, hey, at least they're anti-Nazi, you know, like that kind of thing. No, I mean, even in the Howard Hughes produced original Scarface, you know, you get the bad boy romanticization. Jason Horsley talked, you know, I think we read a little bit in our Polanski episode, but Jason Horsley talking about the propensity to make movies about like romanticized criminals, and that, you know, what is really the root of Hollywood's like fascination of the band of, you know, valorizing the bandit, the desperado, the outlaw. And I think, you know, there is something there, you know, and maybe that also goes back to the frontier mythology that stays like embedded in people's brains, is that, you know, at the end of the day, an outlaw is also a settler. You know what I mean? And like, and you need a bad man out on those plains to do genocide and like intimidate people into like buying all the land so you can have a railroad monopoly or something. We will get to that. There is a book, maybe when we do our Molly's ep, I'll find that PDF I have of the like the making of the Great American Fortunes, which just describes like the brutal, very like There Will Be Blood-esque like primitive accumulation of the American West, and how they just like it was all basically crime. I mean, well, on the level of being like genocide and land theft, it's like a world historical crime, but also just on the level of like violating the actual laws that were on the books in America. Like everything was so incredibly corrupt. Like you could bribe a surveyor. There was a thing about like 5 men bought most of the open land in California by hiring corrupt surveyors to incorrectly classify like grazing land as a swamp. And then if it was a swamp, it was worth like 10 cents on the dollar. So they just had people going around saying like, that's a swamp, and then like bought it for pennies and then immediately jacked the price up for like not a swamp anymore. And like, you know, like a handful of men were basically able to go in and just do that, and for an entire gigantic state. So that's the kind of, you know, thing. It's hard to get off you know, that's a hell of a drug. It's hard to just get off that once the frontier runs out. So I think now we're in the process of just like endlessly inventing or like envisioning new frontier, like constructing new frontiers or turning things into a frontier. Like when you're a settler, like, you know, hammer and a nail, like when you're a settler, everything looks like a frontier that you have to settle, you know?
Yes. True. Yeah. When you're a settler, everything does look like a frontier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you see it in Silicon Valley, you see it all over the place. So, yeah. Interesting.
Next Kennedy episode is going to be the escaping Kennedy episode.
Well, we gotta do King Kill. Maybe not escaping
King
himself, but like King Kill 33. I think.
Eventually we
I'm
do
intrigued.
have to do, his Kennedy book, whatever it's called, Most Dangerous. Is that what it's called? It's just called Most Dangerous.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't realize he had a whole book about Kennedy.
Well, it's kind of about Kennedy. Yeah, it's kind of about Kennedy. It's kind of like autobiographical. We talked about it a little bit in our original one.
Okay.
And the cover just has like a Kennedy 50-cent piece. That's how much the Kennedy things are worth, right? They're not dollars or 50 cents.
I think they were 50 cents. Yeah, Kennedy half dollar.
But on the cover with like flames all around it, with a foreword by Peter Levenda.
Hey, okay.
Once again,
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm surprised he trusts Peter Levenda, but that is intriguing.
No, I think he definitely does trust him. He also wrote the foreword to Most Dangerous Book in the World. Yeah, so.
Yes, he did.
I don't know,
You're
but
right.
maybe not for Blackjack. So.
Not for Blackjack, but yeah,
yeah
we will come back to. It's a gargantuan concept. I feel like everybody, especially this is for the Alwar frequency. I feel like most people in the grotto are like some level of JFK pilled already. And know why it's bullshit, the official story. Mm-hmm. But this is a cool ontological framework for viewing it in like a broader context of kind of American socioeconomic history. And
the Yankee and Cowboy framework.
Yeah, as bad as the capitalists are, they do bicker with one another at times. And I guess, if you think about it, the inter-imperial bickering between the European powers caused World War I, which was horrible, but I think you could make a fair argument that the Russian Revolution would not have happened, certainly not the way it did, if it hadn't been for the imperialists, taking it a step too far and just engaging in this, basically mass sacrifice ritual of sending all their working young people to go kill each other. For 5 years. So I guess that's some way of saying they probably have very horrible plans for us, but they also, a house divided against itself is at least slightly vulnerable, and their shaitanic instincts could always lead them to do damage to one another. That I'm not even going to be that optimistic and say, we don't have a Lenin that could hop on a train and then say no support for the provisional government and come up with all the right ideas and kick out Kerensky. We're in a much tougher situation.
No, we don't.
Basically,
we definitely do
but
not.
still, it's good to point out that they're not always just completely maybe in the same smoke-filled room, all plotting everything together. There are fault lines, there are frictions, contradictions that can maybe be, I don't know if they can be exploited, but they're worth paying attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess we can leave it there, but highly recommend checking this book out. It's a good summary, I think, of both Watergate is sus and the JFK assassination being sus. It's pretty concise.
It is a good summary of that, Yeah, I mean, if you're JFK pilled already, the Watergate stuff was mostly new to me. And I feel like there's a lot of sus connections with Howard Hughes that might be appealing from an SJ perspective. So
totally.
Yeah, and it's it's an interesting meta-historical piece as well, because it was written at a certain time and you can really see the way things were understood then. And the notes also, are very thorough, the footnotes. Some of them are just citations, but a lot of them have longer sort of, discussions of things that I guess were written after the actual manuscript, so they're valuable.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, at least the version that I have. So, I guess the Berkeley edition is the one that I have,
Pretty easy to find online too. Thankfully, it's not like the Control Candy Jones where it's impossible. You can go to your favorite not endorsed place where you find books online for free, and you will probably be able to find it. I'm just gonna leave it at that. Yeah, but good stuff. All right, so.
Word.
That's all for us, and until next time, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.
Ladies and gentlemen, pull out your hankies. Lou Gehrig was the pride of the Yankees. Mothers and daddies, children. King Kong is falling off the building today. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. Wish I could hide away safe in the mall. Something is constantly scheming and brewing to make our lives a disaster movie. And all of the pundits and bandits and speakers and gadgets and $200 sneakers will all be so useless in conjuring Jesus and baseball and science and naming diseases away. Too many firemen and virgins and hell